Chapter 663. At this time, Edward could already see the truth hidden by the swarm of insects. Spears were as sharp as a forest, and arrows were like rain. The tall, jackal-headed men had a dull metallic luster, and their muscles were bulging. These were the guards of Anubis, the god of death, who wielded sharp, heavy weapons. The long time in the underworld had honed their martial arts skills to perfection. Under the cover of the swarm of insects, an army of nearly 1,000 people silently arrived at the foot of the pyramid. Edward was on the verge of despair. He blocked the front with his sword and scanned from left to right. Even the weakest death god's werewolf guards were at the level of a vampire knight. Edward said in despair, "Damn it, Imodin clearly hasn't killed the Scorpion Emperor yet. How can he use the Bracelet of Death? Because the Egyptian gods are taking sides." Chenang's voice came from behind him. He turned around in surprise and saw Chun Ong walking down the steps of the pyramid. He held 2 scriptures across his chest and looked at the guards with interest. "It seems that my several lies have provoked the Egyptian gods," he explained casually. "Otherwise, they wouldn't have forgiven Imodin so easily. However, if they see me as an enemy, then Imodin, who has already ignited the god fire and has the potential to become a god, is a great target to rope in. After all, he was the high priest of ancient Egypt, and the most outstanding one at that. He has a bit of a relationship with the gods. Now that Egypt is in a slump, if Imodin can expand his faith and restore Egypt's glory, then why not give him a god's position? Although the laws of this world have changed, like a dry beach after the tide recedes, the gods can only rely on the holes they dug in advance to survive in this little bit of seawater. The process of Imodin becoming a god is like a land animal standing on the beach, trying to transform into a fish. He doesn't know that the sea is far away in the timeline, and he will suffer the pain of drying up thousands of years later. But it's not the gods who bear this risk, so why should they care? As long as Imodin doesn't kill one or a few of them and take their precious seawater resources, the Egyptian gods won't mind helping him." Chun Ong slowly descended and faced the countless jackal-headed army. "Am I right? Imodin and Anubis? Although you will not be able to unleash the full potential of the death bracelet before you kill the great Emperor Scorpion, with Anubis opening the back door for you, it will not be difficult for you to summon these death guards." Chun Ong shook his head and sneered. "Are they not afraid of losing everything?" Edward's eyes flashed as he asked in a low voice, "You said that this world is a world where the sea ebbs, and the gods of the fish left on the beach when the tide ebbs, relying on the water and the puddles to survive. Then what is the sea? Faith?" Chun Ong shook his head slightly. "The composition of the sea is very complicated. It's a side of the origin force. You can understand it as an environment that has affinity for souls and spirituality. It's a side of the tide of the origin force. The truly powerful gods have already retreated with the tide, such as Fushi, the Eastern Emperor Tai, and Brahma. The ones that remain are all abandoned by this world. Faith is a resource, but it's not what the gods rely on for survival. The origin force is. It's not that they don't need faith now, but the cake left behind is no longer a real scarce resource." Chun Ong looked at the guards of Anubis and sneered. "It seems that enough people have died in the First World War. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the leisure to interfere with the human world. A large number of souls dying in a short period of time will create a relatively small tide, just like the rain from the sky. It can nourish the stupid gods left on the beach, allowing them to temporarily recover their energy. However, they are too active and they are still consuming their life force." Chun Ong glanced at the guards of death surrounding the Great Pyramid of Giza and sneered. "Interfering with the real world on such a large scale will rapidly consume the dividends left by the First World War. This will harm the interests of all the gods. If the Egyptian gods were not the origin of Judaism, and Judaism was split into Christianity, Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Truth Judaism, which make up the majority of the world's faith, and the only religion that can compete with them, Buddhism, has no gods at all, how could they possibly reach an agreement?" Edward's expression became serious. He suddenly understood. Is this the deep background of the mummy world? In this world where the gods have shown their divinity, The background story is not mentioned at all. The truth about the gods? This Professor Chun of the Nine States team is indeed unfathomable. I'm afraid he is already close to the level of a 10-star god. That's why he can sense part of the laws of this world so keenly. Chinong continued. The First World War has just ended, and you people want to start a second full-scale war like this. Greedy and shameless gods. You people have done this again and again, using the large-scale deaths of humans as a temporary change in the origin force to replenish your water source. Although the origin force absorbed by this change is like the difference between fresh water and seawater when you are born, when you're in such a desperate situation, you don't have to hesitate to drink poison to quench your thirst, do you? There was a small commotion among the jackal-headed death guards. Suddenly, these tall jackal-headed men opened up a path, and the handsome former high priest of ancient Egypt, now a demigod, Imidin, appeared in front of Chinong in a black robe. Surrounded by the death guards, he looked straight at Chinong. Imhotep said in a low voice, "Your Majesty, my immortal enemy, thank you for telling me all this, so that I would not be momentarily lost on the path of eternity. You have pushed me onto this path, stripped me of everything, left me with nothing so that I could pursue it. With hatred and venom, you have forced me to pick up what I once feared and despised. In order to take revenge on you, I have killed my former soul. How much do the gods in the sky fear you?" Imidin suddenly looked up and pointed at the stars in the sky. "They should fear you because you are more ruthless and cruel than them. As a mortal, you're more divine and awe-inspiring than the gods. There used to be darkness in front of my eyes until I accepted it with my heart. I always remember that this darkness was given to me by you. The flames of hatred burned in it, and it was by relying on this flame that I was able to avoid being lost in the darkness. The gods gave you the power of revenge because of their fear, but I know it is not enough. This power is not enough, and the fear of the gods is not enough. If they do not use all their strength to fight against you, then in the end, you will make them die without a place to be buried. You will step on the bones of the gods and announce everything you want to create." Imidin's eyes seemed to be burning with flames. He looked up at Chinang's eyes and said in a low voice, "And my soul will forever burn with the flame of revenge, until death." Chapter 664. The surging crowd rushed towards the pyramid under Chinang's feet. A tall jackal-headed Grim Reaper with a pair of halberds leaped high into the air. Edward and Elizabeth had no choice but to fight them head-on. Edward drew out his crossguard. His grip on the hilt was very strange. His other hand could hold the back of the hilt, and his right thumb rested on the blade. He placed the hilt below his waist, and the blade was slanted upwards. The tip of the sword was pointed in the direction of the jackal-headed man's face. This was the plow stance, one of the 4 basic starting stances of the German Richard School of swordsmanship. This was where Edward's basic swordsmanship came from. In the god realm, there were many strange and powerful swordsmanship, but as an Orthodox knight, the military swordsmanship that Edward learned was the foundation of his strength. When he was diligently learning military swordsmanship in the world of the heavenly kingdom, a newcomer who was in the same batch as him was obsessed with the elven swordsmanship in the One Ring that was strengthened by the god realm. But when he grew step by step to the position of captain, that teammate who learned the elven swordsmanship had already died in a certain mission. From then on, Edward knew that dazzling and complicated skills might not be as suitable for him as well-tempered and simple skills. The strengthening of the red dragon blood gave him infinite strength and endless energy. The Templar Kokuho, strengthened in God's realm, allowed him to fight with ease and determination. Facing the halberd in midair, he held the crossguard sword horizontally with both hands. The standard military swordsmanship allowed him to easily pour all the strength in his body into the sword in his hand. The huge strength of the humanoid red dragon made the blade of his sword as heavy as 1,000 pounds. Although the jackal-headed man in midair was tall, it had no leverage point. When the sword and halberd collided, the jackal-headed man's hands shook violently, and its body suddenly lost its balance. After Edward's sword was hindered, he quickly stabbed out from a tricky angle, and the blade easily pierced through the jackal-headed man's ribs. All this happened in the blink of an eye. Edward's sword did not stop. He continued to slash down, splitting open the skull of a jackal-headed man who was rushing towards him. His body took half a step forward and dodged an incoming spear. He used his left arm to clamp the spearhead, and with his right hand, he swung the sword forward along the spear, cutting off a few of the jackal-headed man's fingers. At the same time, he stabbed and twisted his sword, ending its life. Behind him, Elizabeth took out her wand and shouted at the jackal-headed man, "Shadowless divine edge." The invisible sharp force field created chaos among the well-coordinated jackal-headed men, and Edward took this opportunity to kill a few more Death God's guards. However, even though his strength was not ordinary, facing these Death God's guards who were dozens of times stronger than ordinary people, he still felt somewhat helpless. Moreover, these Death God's guards are the most outstanding soldiers. The long tempering in the underworld had not only perfected their martial skills, but also allowed them to cooperate as if they were one person. Any one of the jackal-headed creatures could be easily killed by Edward, but the fact that there were so many of them in battle made them even more threatening. After Edward made a lot of gains in the beginning, he quickly fell into a bitter battle. Even Elizabeth was targeted by the priests of the Death Guards, who kept using spells to restrain her. The Death God's guards who rushed up to the pyramid felt as if they had hit an iron wall. They could only see the light of the swords rotating on the pyramid. Dozens of thin and small men in black slashed down with the curved swords in their hands. They were in groups of 3. Some of them were low on the ground and swung down with a slash, while others jumped up nimbly, the light of the swords in their hands reflecting the bright moon in the sky. There were also dozens of calm gunshots that sounded sporadically. The jackal-headed creatures who climbed up to the pyramid were either hit in the legs, or had blood spurting out of their necks, or had their heads blown off by snipers. As soon as they came into contact with the jackal-headed creatures, they all fell. On top of the pyramid, Chenong still maintained a transcendent calmness. In front of him, there were already nearly 100 Blood Clan members in black, silently forming the first line of defense. Imodin stood tall in the midst of thousands of soldiers. Dozens of priests of the Death Guards beside him took out their hands and whispered incantations in the direction of Chun Ong. Imodin looked at Chun Ong with a silent expression. He saw Edward and Edward standing at the forefront of the battle line, and he just smiled coldly. A jackal-headed creature with a sword beside him, whose entire body turned illusory like a soul, whizzed toward Edward. Its body was half illusory and half real. Like a phantom, it passed through countless Death Guards who were charging toward the pyramid. This was a real Death Guard, one of the most powerful beings under Imodin. As a sword servant, it had the same status as a priest who served God. In ancient Egypt, such a person was known as the guard captain because of his powerful swordsmanship. Edward let out a furious roar, the long sword in his hand bursting with intense holy light. Using the strength of his waist, he circled and slashed with his crossguard, finally creating a relatively safe golden circle before the Death Guard arrived. There was not a single living Death Guard within the length of his arm and his sword. Edward looked at the Death Guard captain with a serious expression. He had already regarded it as the most terrifying enemy he had ever faced in this world. He held the sword horizontally, the hilt level with his shoulder. He looked at the tip of the sword, and all the holy power in his body was ready to be unleashed. At this moment, a green vine that looked like a python or a dragon popped up from under his feet and quickly grabbed on Edward's right leg. The snake-like carnivorous vine with long fangs bit toward Edward's thigh. "Venomous vine!" while Elizabeth shouted anxiously. She quickly waved her wand, trying to cast a protective armor on Edward. However, the venomous vine that Imodin had modified with the power of the curse was even more poisonous than when it was in the hands of a druid. Edward could already feel his right leg itching and numbing. The poison had penetrated through the armor and into his body. The venomous vine's snake-like fangs were even more poisonous. If he let it enter his blood, the consequences would be unimaginable. What's more, there was also the Death Guard captain who was rushing toward him with his sword. Edward didn't know how many times he had cursed Hans and his teammates. They were dead, but he didn't know how many terrifying tricks they had left for Immoden. As soon as the venomous vine appeared, the captain of the nightmare team was in a desperate situation. If Edward swung his sword to deal with the venomous vine, then the Death Guard captain's sword would pierce through his vitals. If he ignored this venomous snake, who knew what would happen? Just when Edward was about to lose all hope, a flash of sword light appeared behind him. Luo Sheng lowered his body and swung his sword. When the venomous vine pounced toward Edward's throat, he cut off the head of the vine. The fanged mouth fell into the dust, and Edward let out a sigh of relief. His long sword slashed forward, parrying the long sword of the Death God's guard. The flash of sword light in Luo Sheng's hand was like a swimming dragon or a lightning bolt, leaping through the throat of a nearby, jackal-headed man. The two cooperated with each other and actually suppressed the Death Guard captain. Edward's swordsmanship was like a knife chopping and an axe chopping, forming the framework for the joint attack. It was also up to him to quickly destroy the enemy's attack. Luo Sheng's sword light was like a butcher dismembering an ox, skillfully and easily filling in the flesh and blood of Edward's swordsmanship. When the jackal-headed man's attack was broken, Luo Sheng's sword would pierce into the gap and reap the enemy's life like a scythe. Elizabeth came back to her senses. With tears in her eyes, she set up iron armor for the two on the battlefield. At the same time, she waved her wand rapidly, desperately adding layers of obstacles in front of the two on the front line. Curtain of darkness. Elizabeth heard someone behind her shout in a low voice. Black fog floated several feet in front of Edward and Luo Sheng, blocking the Death Guard's sight. Protect against long-range weapons. Another protective spell was cast on the two. The arrows shot by the archers in the rear of the Death Guard formation were slid away by a smooth force field before they could reach the two. Then, countless bats flew out from the entrance of the pyramid behind Elizabeth and plunged into the curtain of darkness. Some of them lay on the jackal-headed man's throat and sucked blood, while others carried corrosive blood flames. A bat transformed into a human in the air. The pale-faced David pierced the chest of a Death Guard with his aristocratic foil sword. Then another figure rushed out. David's body expanded several times, and the axe in his hand chopped down with unstoppable force, sending two Death Guards flying. The Arabian was agile, and the two scimitars in his hands drew two strange curves, slashing across the neck of a Death Guard. The five Samsara travelers quickly expanded the battlefield, creating a defensive circle of about 15 feet, back-to-back with each other, protecting the entrance of the pyramid and Elizabeth behind them. Luo Sheng and Edward worked together, and after several rounds, finally created an opportunity. Luo Sheng's sword light was like a swimming dragon. He leaped into the air and lightly borrowed the strength of a Death Guard spear. There was a sword cry, and like a flash of lightning in the air, Edward only saw a biting cold sword light piercing through the air. Even though the target was not him, he still felt chills all over his body. The sword light tore through the golden defensive circle of the Death Guard's steady swordsmanship, and in the nick of time, pierced its throat. Although it seemed to be only a sword mark, in fact, its entire body was pierced by the sword chi. Edward was dumbfounded. The great difference between the two swordsmanship systems made it difficult for him to understand what was happening in front of him. Even Immoden, who was surrounded by the death priests, could not help but look solemn for a moment when he saw the dazzling sword light. Then, he bent his palm like a hook and stretched it forward. A force containing the power of the curse broke through the air and tore at Luo Sheng. Immoden's attack was not exquisite, but his power was as deep as the sea. Luo Sheng only felt an unparalleled force coming at him, like an avalanche, with hidden killing intent. Under this dark claw mark, even his soul seemed to be shaken, and he only felt that his mind was muddled. His life was hanging by a thread, but he was unable to fight back. Edward stepped forward with his sword, but before he could block it, he felt a sharp pain in his head and almost could not hold the crossword in his hand. Chapter 665. Immoden's attack was earth-shattering, temporarily crippling Luo Sheng, who posed the greatest threat to him among the reincarnators. It was also at this moment that the situation took a complete turn. The Death God's Guard silently surged forward like a tide. The tall, jackal-headed man, wielding a heavy weapon, stood out and became the center of the battle formation. The agile, jackal-headed man, wielding a dagger and trident, was an assassin among the Death God's Guards who was proficient in surprise attacks and assassination. They were agile and unafraid of death, often willing to risk their lives to create opportunities for their companions. A few Death God's Guards wielding javelins and bows were responsible for providing support from the rear, while protecting the two priests who had separated from Immoden. They only spent a few breaths on the battlefield to reorganize the battle formation according to the reincarnators. 6 Death God's Guards wielding long halberds were responsible for locking down the reincarnators' weapons, while 5 short Death God's Guards wielding knives were responsible for blocking the reincarnators' long-range attacks. The Death God's Guards wielding long weapons stood in the front row, while the Death God's Guards wielding short weapons stuck close to the back of the Death God's Guards. When Edward and the others saw the jackal-headed man's movements, their faces were as ugly as death. The number of troops they faced was less than half of the Death God's Guards they had just killed. However, an organized enemy was completely different from an unorganized enemy. Before they could make a targeted arrangement, the reincarnators would face unprecedented pressure. Before reaching the 8-star level, the reincarnators were most afraid of such large-scale, organized enemies. Players who had played role-playing games knew that the scariest thing in a game wasn't the boss, but the swarm of small monsters. Players could easily slaughter these small monsters one by one. Once a certain number of small monsters reached a certain number, and with all classes, it would be a nightmare. When facing such a large group of enemies, those who knew how to cooperate and those who didn't were on 2 different levels. For those who didn't know how to cooperate, the reincarnators could still make use of the limited contact space during close combat to achieve the effect of limiting the number of enemies they could come into contact with at the same time. When the Death God's Guards had attacked, Edward had only faced 4 or 5 enemies at the same time in his most difficult time. When the 5 of them coordinated with each other, they were able to guarantee that each of them would not face more than 3 enemies, and they did not need to pay too much attention to their blind spots. This was how they managed to achieve greater results, killing and injuring dozens of Death God's Guards. But now, Immoden had adjusted the battle formation, separating the Samsara travelers from the battlefield. With 2 jackal-headed Death Guard captains as the backbone, they had reorganized the battle formation. Although the number of enemies they were facing did not seem to have increased, the tacit understanding between these Death Guard captains was like moving clouds and flowing water. With 3 to 5 of them working as one, the threat they posed had increased exponentially. The jackal-headed men had paid a small price to separate the reincarnators from the battlefield. After retreating from the pyramid, they had accumulated an even greater force, and their formation was no longer restricted by the reincarnators. Now, the situation on the battlefield had been completely reversed. Immoden raised his right hand high, and the death priest beside him blew the horn. The sound of the horn was melodious and heavy, resounding throughout the entire battlefield. Dozens of Death God's Guards, who had already set up their battle formation, were the first to pounce on the reincarnators. The jackal-headed men, wielding heavy hammers, halberds, and other long-handled weapons, were the first to swing their weapons at Edward and the others. Behind them, the agile Death God's Guard wielding a scimitar lowered his body and lowered his head into a half-squat. He was like a jackal that was running on all 4s. Blade light blossomed from the waist of the halberd-wielding and hammer-wielding guards, and a streak of blade light slashed at the waist of the reincarnators. Above the reincarnators, the halberds and hammers were raised high and chopped down. The 2 halberd-wielding guards worked together, and a scimitar-wielding guard was like a killer move. None of the reincarnators were weak. They used their own unique skills and barely managed to hold on under the exquisite cooperation of the Death God's Guards. But in the end, the pressure was unbearable. David's body swelled to twice its original size. He had been stabbed in the ribs. Relying on his recovery ability, it was not a big problem, but there was still a gap in his cooperation with the others. The assassin guard beside him took advantage of this gap and rushed into the core of the Reincarnators' battle formation. At this time, the Reincarnators not only had to face the fierce attacks from the front, but they also had to guard against the arrows from the back. David exchanged injury for injury, taking the opportunity of being hit by a heavy blade. He broke the sternum of the scimitar guard and sent him flying back. But immediately, someone else took his place. David's recovery ability was strong, but the opponent seemed to be endless. Instead, he could not withstand the pressure and was separated further and further away from the other Reincarnators. After David was separated, the Death God's guards did not give the Reincarnators a chance to adjust. Instead, they pressed forward, except for Luo Sheng and Edward, who cooperated well with each other. The others were separated from the battlefield. The Reincarnators were separated from the small group of 5 people and Elizabeth, a long-range attacker, into 4 independent groups. The Reincarnators faced the joint attack of 2 halberd-wielding guards, a scimitar guard, and a dagger assassin. They also had to be careful of the arrows of the archers and the strange spells of the priests. For a moment, they were flustered and in danger. David was injured several times, and the situation was not optimistic. The other Death God's guards had already bypassed them and attacked the Great Pyramid. Unlike the small team that faced them, the Death God's guards directly fought with Chun Ang's vampires in a large-scale battle formation. The halberd-wielding guards stood at the forefront. Their barbed halberds were ready to hook the vampires' feet from the pyramid at any time. If a vampire in black was unlucky enough to be hooked by them, they would immediately be chopped into meat paste by the scimitar guards behind them. The archers and priests standing at the back of the formation accurately launched a rain of arrows and spells at the places where the formation of the vampires in black was unstable. Another group of Death God's guards attacked from the sides and the back. They were preparing to attack the Great Pyramid of Giza from all sides. If one looked down from the sky, they would see a black tide of Death God's guards surrounding the entire Great Pyramid of Giza. Some of them had already climbed onto the Great Pyramid of Giza and were preparing to shoot at the Great Pyramid of Giza. Imodin watched as Chun Ang's battle line was on the verge of collapse. However, there was no trace of arrogance on his face. The Samsara travelers were drowned in the tide of undead. The Death God's guards were coming at them from all directions. There was danger everywhere. David's chest was pierced by a halberd, but he did not even have a chance to pull out. He could only watch as the others twisted the halberd in his chest. His strength was slowly drained out of his body along with his blood. 2 halberds locked onto his weapon, one on the left and one on the right. The vicious assassin took the opportunity to stab a dagger into David's spine, cutting off his senses in the lower half of his body. David was on the brink of despair. He roared at the sky in anger, but he was smashed in the head by a huge hammer. David was also in a bad situation. He was cursed by the Death God's guards. He tried to drink the recovery potion from the god's space several times, but the Death God's guards always interrupted him. Since vampires had high agility, he was able to dodge the attacks at first. However, the space he had to move around was extremely limited. If it were not for the powerful recovery ability of the vampires, he would have died a long time ago. The Arabian was terrified. He worked together with a veiled woman and had the woman block a knife for him several times. Thus, he was still in good condition. However, the woman was in imminent danger, and he was afraid that he would not be able to hold on for long. Elizabeth hid in the passage of the pyramid. Alone, she faced the saturated attacks from the opposite side. It was difficult for her to provide any effective support to Edward. Moreover, a few Death God's guard were trying to bypass Edward and rush towards her. The situation was extremely critical. A Death God's guard wielding a sword rushed in front of Chenong. His sword trembled in front of Chenong. The Death God's guard roared and slashed his sword 3 times. The tip of the sword swung towards Chenong. A figure flashed beside Chenong, and the Death God's guard's head flew high into the air. Looking at Imodin, who was looking up at him, Chenong smiled and made a shooting gesture. Bang! Chenong mimicked the sound of a gunshot. Looking at the unpredictable expression on Imodin's face, Ing Long held his sword, which was still dripping with blood. He silently guarded in front of Chun Ong. Chun Ong acted as if he did not see what was happening around him. He said indifferently, "Imodin, you still need to learn. Your brain is still from 3,000 years ago. You don't have a deep understanding of the giant ships and cannons of our imperialism. How can I hand over the task of liberating Egypt and all of humanity to you?" Chapter 666. Dozens of biplanes flew across the Nile River and headed toward the Great Pyramid of Giza. They were the Camel fighter jets designed by the British Sopwith Company. Of course, they had been modified so much that even the Sopwith Company's designers could not recognize them. This type of World War I plane had a maximum speed of 195 kilometers per hour and an altitude of 5,800 meters. Chun Ong had modified it to be close to the standard of World War II planes. Even Chun Ong could not overcome the inherent speed of the biplanes. However, Chun Ong had made full use of its excellent flight stability. The two machine guns on the plane had also been modified by Chun Ong into cannons. When the plane was close to the ground, a series of fire chains shot out from the two humps of the camel and swept across the formation of Imodin's Reaper Guards. The great power of the cannons cut the jackals in half. The engine of the camel had been modified by magic. Because of the aerodynamic force of the wings, its carrying capacity was even greater than that of most monoplanes of World War II. On the wings of the plane, two mummies let go of their hands and dived down. These newly modified vampire mummies had half of their bodies turned into sand, and the other half glided with their bat wings. They accurately threw themselves into the key positions of Imodin's Reaper army. Their bodies turned into sand in mid-air, turning into a sandstorm. When these mummies got close to the ground, they suddenly burst into flames. The huge sandstorm that covered a distance of more than 10 meters was instantly engulfed in flames. The bombs that were dropped by the mummies also detonated for the first time. A large amount of white phosphorus incendiary and epoxy ethane were sprayed evenly on the battlefield, covering Imodin's army like a cloud. Then, the flaming mummies set everything on fire. Chun Ong had prepared everything according to the specifications of fuel air bombs. Due to technical reasons, he could not create the most lethal pressure field. However, the incendiary that had been modified by magic potions was much more powerful than similar products. Chun Ong had even used Elisabeth's fire curse as a reference. Under the guidance of the Great Pyramid of Giza's magic barrier, the fire around the Great Pyramid of Giza silently changed its nature. The fire that targeted souls and curses turned dark red, just like the magma of hell. This hellfire was unprecedentedly destructive to the Death God's guards. In an instant, the number of Death God's guards that fell was several times more than the number that died in battle before. Imodin's army was instantly dealt a heavy blow. A whistling sound came from the sky. Imodin had just torn apart two camels in anger when he sensed an unfamiliar sense of urgency in front of him. He had never heard that kind of whistling sound before. The samsara travelers who were lucky enough to escape the fire almost peed their pants. David almost fell to the ground. The injury on his spine had not recovered yet. He limped toward the tunnel leading to the pyramid. The samsara travelers were very familiar with that sound. It was the sound of the king of war, the roar of the cannons. However, when he and the other captains who were lucky enough to escape arrived at the entrance of the tunnel, they heard a slight rustling sound coming from inside. It sounded like a rattlesnake slithering over tiny grains of sand. Deep inside the tunnel, even with the eyes of the samsara travelers, they could only see a blurry shadow. Edward and the others immediately raised their vigilance. They saw a few wriggling, snake-like shadows in the distance. As the mysterious shadows got closer, they finally saw the identity of the shadows. Giant octopuses covered in mucus wriggled in front of them. The tentacles of the octopuses were equipped with drills, guns with a completely different structure, and tentacles with strange horns and fangs that spread out at the end of their tails. When they reached the middle of the path, the octopuses suddenly sped up. Their tails hit the ground as they leaped forward quickly, like a jumping fish. The leading octopus walked past the samsara travelers without hesitation. It plunged into the sand and disappeared into the desert as if it was swimming. More octopuses swarmed out of the pyramids. They came from the Great Pyramid of Giza, the narrow north-south passage above the pyramids, and from behind the giant rocks that had been moved away from the pyramids. All of them swarmed out of the pyramids like a fountain. Most of them went straight into the desert through secret underground tunnels. Some of them held guns in all 8 of their tentacles and fired in all directions. Some operated cannons and missiles. Powerful firepower poured down from the 3 pyramids. The vampire octopuses clung to the pyramids and operated the machine guns and cannons. They also used their sharpest tentacles to pierce the chests of the Grim Reapers. There were also some strange insects that were only half the height of a human and shaped like a praying mantis. They moved like phantoms in the middle of the battlefield. Their 2 appendages quickly swept past the vital parts of the Grim Reapers. They were as fast as lightning, but their sickle-like appendages were even faster. In a flash, they would reap the heads of the Grim Reapers. Under the sand, the vampire octopuses that had undergone special modifications could swim in the desert as if they were swimming in the sea. Their tentacles pierced out from the ground, and the drills tore through the bodies of the Grim Reapers. Muffled gunshots could be heard coming from underground. Immoden's army not only had to deal with the bullets nearby, but they also had to guard against the sniper shots coming from underground. In the direction of Cairo, Immoden saw a long line of armored vehicles rapidly approaching. The second round of air raids was about to come. Immoden did not think that these were his reinforcements. Every time Immoden prepared to turn the tables with magic, the huge boundary formed by the 3 pyramids interfered with him. Immoden's goal of probing had been achieved. He understood that he could not threaten Chenong this time. Therefore, Immoden looked in the direction of Chun-Ong on the pyramid and curled his lips slightly. His cold and cruel eyes were completely different from before. Then he whispered in ancient Egyptian, "I will be back. The next time I come back, I will bring the curse of the gods and my army of the Grim Reapers to you." At that moment, the undying hatred of the undead will bathe the entire earth in blood. Chenong looked at Immoden's back and said softly, "I'm looking forward to it." The moment the sun completely rose from the ground, the world suddenly darkened. The rising sun was swallowed by the abyss of darkness. At that moment, the entire Egypt was so dark that one could not even see their own fingers. The residents of Cairo were already frightened by the events of the night. The moment they were swallowed by the darkness, they screamed and screamed in fear. However, the battlefield near the Great Pyramid of Giza fell into silence at that moment. It was as if the battlefield had fallen into silence for a moment. Edward could clearly hear his own breathing. In the darkness, time seemed like a year to him. Finally, after a quarter of an hour, the sun dominated the land again. The Grim Reapers on the battlefield had disappeared without a trace. Even their heavily injured corpses were gone. Everything felt like an illusion. If it were not for the smoke and the smell of blood, Edward would have thought that he had fallen into Immoden's illusion. The last song of the 10 disasters, the dark disaster. Chenong sighed. The 10 disasters of Cairo are finally over. Chapter 667. When the morning sun of a new day shone on Cairo, Chenong appeared on the streets of Cairo with the Blood Clan guards. Yesterday, Immoden's burning of the city did not have a serious impact on Cairo. Even the port area, which was the hardest hit, had been put out with the help of Horus I, and peace was restored. Although there were still traces of disaster left in the city by the meteors and hailstones, Cairo had restored order. Chun-Ong had finally succeeded in dragging out the mission in this world. Before Immoden died, they could all stay in this world. Of course, Immoden's strength was rising every moment, but this was Chun-Ang's goal. He needed a chess piece to destroy the current world order and create chaos that affected the whole world. In Chun-Ang's plan for the undead empires in the east and the west, Immoden currently did not have enough strength to challenge the Western powers, so Chun-Ong had to give him more. On the one hand, the Egyptian gods supported Immoden, and on the other hand, he had to let Immoden understand the horror of modern technology. Chun-Ong did not think that a group of undead with cold weapons could threaten the British and French imperialists. The runic power that Imodin mastered definitely had the potential to create an unprecedented magic civilization. Chun-Ong was still counting on him to lead the Death Army, drive the magic mobile armor, and engineer mechanical troops to attack London and turn Great Britain into a country of undead. It's a pity that there are no teams among the reincarnators that strengthen the magic system related to World of Warcraft. Otherwise, I will want to forge Frostmourne again and send Imodin to the Throne of Ice. Chun-Ong said to Zhang Ziqiang with a smile. Again, Zhang Ziqiang was stunned. Are you saying that you forged once before? Chun-Ong smiled and did not answer. They had arrived in front of the largest temple of the Saint Truth in Cairo. When the warriors of the Saint Truth in front of the temple saw Chun-Ong and a large group of black-clothed guards wearing the symbol of the Eye of Horus, they suddenly became nervous. They pressed their hands on their machetes. At this time, it was the morning ritual of the Saint Truth, one of the 5 services of the Saint Truth. The temple was full of believers of the Saint Truth. Those believers were devoutly looking in the direction of Mecca in the east, with their buttocks in the air and their heads bowed. Chun-Ong barged into the temple directly. The 2 warriors guarding the door looked at the solemn and capable black-clothed vampire behind him and didn't dare to stop him. Chun-Ang's boots made contact with the marble slabs in the temple, producing a crisp sound. The worshippers raised their heads, wanting to see who was so bold as to disturb the worship of the sacred god. Wasn't he afraid that Allah would punish him or that the priest would self-destruct? Chun-Ong stood in the direction where they were kowtowing and looked down at the believers who were kneeling in front of him. The worshippers on the ground were in a commotion. Chun-Ong said to them in Arabic, "No one is allowed to stand up. As the local lord, the holy sultan, your master and ruler, I have something to say to you." A priest in a white robe who was leading the worship stood up angrily and shouted, "The infidel is not worthy of being our lord. Without our recognition, the Sultan of Egypt will not be recognized by the Islamic law. It is illegal." Chun-Ong did not say a word. He pointed at him and said, "Him." Then he pointed at the people who stood up with the priest and said, "Him, him, and him. Don't let any of these people who stand up go." The Blood Clan beside him did not hold a gun. Instead, they raised their bows and aimed. The arrows of the Blood Clan were as accurate as sniper rifles. Very soon, the iron arrowhead of a rough wooden longsword pierced through the chest of the priest, sending his body flying backward. He fell onto the mat in the crowd. The sound of the bowstring sounded without any delay. It was as orderly as the strings of a musical instrument. The dull sound of the bowstring bouncing sounded in the air. It was like an overture, accompanied by the sound of the arrow entering the human body and the moans and screams of the worshippers on the ground. It was a sad song for the followers of the gospel of truth. In the eyes of Chun-Ong, their lives had no value at all. Even if they were used as magic materials, they would depreciate due to the great purge that would inevitably be carried out next. There would no longer be a lack of human test subjects in the land of Egypt. Human lives would also become the cheapest thing in Chun-Ang's hands. They would become the Blood Clan coming off the production line and become cheap consumables in magic experiments and scientific research. Worship 5 times a day, 1.5 hours each time. Chun-Ong waved his finger in front of the followers of the gospel of truth and said, "Ghosts have time to wait for you. Other than scriptures and dogma in your heads, you want this and that. You don't eat this and that. You don't coexist with the people of this race, and you grimace at the slightest thing. Did I hire you to work? Even the undead are more adapted to industrialization than you. I came to Egypt to start a business to bring you happiness. Why don't you understand? Isn't being a worker happier than being a slave? I created a miracle in the history of human industry. Within 3 years, I turned Egypt into an industrialized country. Can't you maintain your dedication? Dedicate your life, dignity, soul, and so on. Anything that I think is valuable? The reason why I kept you here is because you are humans and have brains. You can do some work that the undead and machines can't do. But how did you repay me? Worship 5 times a day, delaying the progress of the assembly line, refusing to study, refusing to even use toilet paper. When I let the women come out to work, you rape them and strangle them to death. You are a group of industrial maggots that are not even comparable to the undead. If this goes on, my only choice is to turn all of you into undead. Do you really think that we capitalists are vegetarians? Let me tell you, I'm a capitalist with knives and guns. I'm a slave supervisor who talks with whips and chains. We do not accept that kind of low efficiency. But if you're really not willing to be laborers, then all of you could be industrial raw materials. I will use your souls as fuel and your flesh and blood as materials to create mummies, skeletons, golems, and puppets. Looking at the Blood Clan members in black dragging away the corpses in front of them, Chun-Ong sneered and said, "I have had enough of you." Chun-Ong told Ing-Long, who was next to him, "Get ready to start the purge. Consume all the people in this country who are not suitable for industrialization. We need to quickly make Egypt a civilized country, quickly expand the population of the Blood Clan, and strengthen our controllability. At present, we can only control a few cities in Egypt. In the local areas, the tribal elders and chiefs have been unwilling to cooperate with our one-year development plan. In that case, don't keep them. To build a strong and powerful grassroots organization, don't worry about consuming the population. Aren't there many black countries and white immigrants nearby? Once Egypt is cleaned up, go there and plunder the population." Ing-Long replied. Imidin seems to have left Egypt recently. According to the satellite, there are signs of large-scale massacres and blood sacrifices in the nearby black tribes. Should we go and stop him? Chun-Ong thought for a moment, then shook his head and said, "There's no need. Let's do our job first and clean up Egypt." Imidin knows that using blood sacrifices to revive his army is not the most important thing. He knows that if he doesn't kill the great Emperor Magic Scorpion, he can only struggle at death's door forever. With Imidin's wisdom, it's not difficult for him to see that only by building a death god army with firearms and explosives can he fight against us. He won't stay for long. In the end, we still have to fight a bloody battle at the oasis where the great Emperor Magic Scorpion died. Now that he wants to know more about this world, we have to prepare to attack Suez. Imidin will definitely join in. If he doesn't come, the reincarnation team that has sided with him will remind him to come. Now in Egypt, we have to clean up the bugs of the Church of Truth and reorganize the organization. In this process, we will make full use of the reincarnation teams that have sided with us. Now that they are also shareholders, they should be able to show their faces. Chun-Ong set his sights on the vast territory of Egypt that the Suez Canal passed through. Only by controlling this golden waterway could he make use of the advantage of transportation to quickly expand the influence of the Blood Clan under his command in the world. Raw materials, machinery, and technology from all over the world would take root in Egypt. It would be the necessary fertilizer for the seeds of the Republic of China to germinate. The vampire octopus had already sneaked into the Mediterranean Sea through the Nile River. As a civilization with a single consciousness, although their potential had been greatly weakened, as a foreshadowing, it was already strong enough. Chapter 668. In a haze that was like an illusion, Evelyn came to a splendid palace in a trance. In the distorted light and shadow, countless men and women wearing or not wearing the traditional robes of ancient Egypt's Nugbai shuttled back and forth in the magnificent hall. Most of them were dressed very lightly. Even the most distinguished priests and nobles only wore a simple linen robe. From Evelyn's point of view, the entire palace was simply immoral. When she retracted her gaze, she could not help but scream out loud. In the reflection of the gold ornaments, she saw her own appearance. She was wearing a long dress that was known as tunic in ancient Egypt, and her chest was almost exposed to the air. For a traditional woman in the 20th century, this could be regarded as a humiliation. However, the people around her weren't much better. Based on the simple and crude ancient Egyptian archaeology of the 20th century, Evelyn didn't know about some of the breakthroughs in modern archaeology regarding ancient Egypt. For example, the Egyptians' obsession with nudity. Due to being located in the tropics and the extremely underdeveloped textile industry during the ancient Egyptian civilization, The Egyptians were used to being naked. In the illusion, Evelyn was fortunate enough to see this precious historical information. Naked servants and waiters walked to and fro in the hall. Precious fresh fruits and food were served. The young children were all naked. The noble women and noblemen weren't any better. Evelyn saw her father's favorite concubine, Ansuna, exposing her dyed breasts while the high priest, Imidin, stared at them without blinking. This is simply immoral. Evelyn, who was educated in traditional Christianity, almost screamed. Of course, she didn't know that in early Christianity, prostitutes had the custom of doing business at the entrance of the church. Their largest group of customers were the priests in the church. In the Old Testament, King Solomon of Judah had once ordered people to disperse those women. For this reason, he had a conflict with the elders of the church. Wait, Evelyn finally came back to her senses. Why did I call that woman Aunt Suna? And why can I see Imidin? Who is the man I call father? Nina. She saw an old man with the most gorgeous jewelry waving at her enthusiastically amidst the crowd. Evelyn saw herself, hearing the old man's call. She walked towards him quickly and happily. The old man opened his arms and said loudly, "Nina, my most beautiful daughter, the princess of Egypt, the brightest pearl on the Nile River." The surrounding people cheered. Evelyn even saw O'Connor among the cheering crowd. As a guard, he stood respectfully beside the priest of the sun god, serving the pharaoh. Next, Evelyn saw herself and Anxuna begin the duel, and Anxuna was more skilled than one. The pharaoh stood up and said, "The person who is suitable to protect me is my beloved concubine, and I will give the bracelet of death to my princess for safekeeping." Evelyn saw a strange bracelet made of gold placed in front of her. The bracelet looked like a scorpion, emitting a dazzling light unique to gold. Evelyn looked at the gorgeous bracelet, as if her entire soul was attracted to it. She stared at it in a daze until her soul floated up and was sucked into the bracelet by an invisible force of attraction. Evelyn shuddered. She screamed and woke up from her nightmare. O'Connor, who was next door, shouted, "Evelyn, what happened?" When he rushed in from outside the door, he saw Evelyn clutching the blanket and looking at the void in front of her in horror. O'Connor asked anxiously, and she replied, "It's nothing, O'Connor. I had a nightmare." O'Connor walked to her bedside and comforted her, saying, "It should be because of that adventure. Ever since you came back from Hemyanata, you have been in deep thought, hiding a great deal of depression in your heart. Everything is over. Those people will not come back to find us. Listen, tomorrow we will leave Cairo by ship and head to London. Although those people are very scary, the gold they provided us is enough for you to study in England." O'Connor said gently, "Now that Cairo has fallen into the hands of the Eye of Horus, the entire city is killing people. Those ruthless men in black are not only killing the local believers, but also taking over all the functions of the Egyptian government. Now, other than the area around the Suez Canal, which is still safe with England's protection, the rest of Egypt has become a nightmare on earth." "No, O'Connor." Evelyn shook her head. "It's not over. Far from it. We can't escape this whirlpool. This is something that is fated. I am the princess of ancient Egypt, and you are the guard of Ra. The monster that ran out from Hemyanata is the lover of my father's favorite concubine, Ansuna. The high priest, your immediate superior, Imidin. This is all your illusion." O'Connor interrupted her. "You are too nervous, so you treated the archaeological materials you studied during the day as your own memory. This is just a nightmare. Practice for a while, and you'll be fine." O'Connor passed the blanket to her and repeated, "Tomorrow we will leave Cairo and take a boat from the Suez Canal to London. Soon, we will be far away from this nightmare." After O'Connor turned and left, Evelyn was stunned for a long time. She said to herself, "Ansuna and Imidin conspired to kill the pharaoh? That's why Imidin suffered the most terrible punishment in Egypt, the insect bite. As for the priests who are bitten by the insects, their magic power will become stronger and stronger in this eternal torture. When they break the seal, they will destroy Cairo. They will cause the 10 catastrophes by the Nile River, turn the river into blood, and let the heavenly fire burn Cairo. Evelyn matched the legend recorded in the documents with what had happened not long ago. She hugged her head in horror and said, "So, the divine punishment that tried to destroy Egypt not long ago was the curse of Imidin." "Right, the bracelet of death." Evelyn quietly stood up and rummaged through the documents she had packed. She rummaged through the messy pile of documents and found a photocopy of a document. The bracelet of the Grim Reaper should be here. In the records of the ancient Egyptian Scorpion King, the Scorpion King sold his soul to Anubis when he was defeated and on the verge of death. In return, he obtained an incomparably mystical treasure that could recruit the dead in the underworld as warriors. This should be the bracelet of death. In that dream, I was the princess of ancient Egypt. Through a martial arts competition, I obtained the bracelet of death, and Ansuna was responsible for protecting my father, the pharaoh Djoser. In the end, she and her lover, Imidin, killed my father. What the hell? No wonder I hate Ansuna so much. That's not all. The voice that came from behind Evelyn almost made her scream. However, she soon realized that she could not make sound. She turned around in horror and saw the nightmarish man standing behind her, looking at her calmly. Chinong said calmly, "You hate your aunt Ansuna so much. I guess it's also because you two are rivals in love, right?" "Aunt Ansuna?" Evelyn's mouth was wide open. She realized that she could make a sound again. She said, "Rival in love? Are you saying that I like Imidin?" No. I can't have an affair with him." Chinang's expression was very rich. He smiled and said with interest, "Of course not Imidin. Then why did you?" Evelyn suddenly froze. She said in horror, No, it can't be like this." "You mean?" "Yes. If Ansuna had not killed the pharaoh, you would have been the pharaoh's queen. The princess of Egypt, the pharaoh's bride-to-be. Ansuna is your father's sister. If your father had not died, you would have married him. If he had died, you would have married his son, your elder brother. As an archaeologist, you should know that in the pharaoh's royal family, women also have the right to inherit. Therefore, in order to prevent the royal power from falling, the pharaoh would marry their own sisters or even daughters to a boy like O'Connor." Chinong said emotionally, "What a chaotic royal family." Chapter 669. Betrayal? Imidin sneered. "There has never been any betrayal. It was only because of shameful, disgusting nonsense. Ansuna is King Djoser's younger sister, and I am powerful enough to marry her. However, King Djoser is a bastard. In order to protect his power, he married Nina's mother, who is second only to him, as his wife. When he was middle-aged, he married the youngest daughter of the former pharaoh. My Ansuna," Imidin said angrily. At that time, his daughter Nina was about the same age as Ansuna. That little bitch. She wanted to frame Ansuna so that her father would shamelessly marry her. Imidin's body trembled slightly. He gritted his teeth and cursed. "I hate these ignorant, shameless mortals and those disgusting gods. The so-called divine marriage law, the so-called noble bloodline, the descendants born of deformed, twisted, and terrifying. I have personally dealt with several deformed monsters for King Djoser. Those monsters were born with great power. Their life forms were distorted, and they were born with a curse. Some of them were even more powerful than their parents. In order to cover up this shameless behavior, the pharaohs declared that they were abominations of God, monsters born from the noble bloodline of Ra. These monsters were born with great power, but their lives were completely distorted. So the pharaoh would hand them over to the priests. Some of the priests would burn them, and some would send them to the underworld for Anubis to watch. It was only later that I understood why the gods had created such a shameless law. It was because they needed it. At that time, the world was no longer suitable for them to live in. In order to maintain their power, they needed the product of the distortion of divinity, the abominations. Anubis collected these existences for them to eat and replenish their divine power. And Imidin's eyes were extremely terrifying. He turned his head and said word by word, "Are there accomplices?" Behind Imidin, the leader of the Yama team, Shinagong, frowned. He bowed and said, "Your Highness, please be careful with your words. They can't hear what we're saying here. My servant, although I despise it, I am already one of them. In my domain, they can't investigate." Imodin sighed. "The army that existence sent to fight me feels very familiar. That bloodthirsty impulse, that evil essence, it reminds me of some memories from when I was a priest. In the inheritance of the high priest, there seems to be such a thing recorded. There was a great pharaoh whose concubine was cursed by a demon. When he sucked the curse out of her wound, he was also infected and had to live on blood from then on." Imodin scoffed at this legend. "Of course, this is the shameless falsification of history by those in power. That's not the devil, but the sin of God. They're the products of the distorted bloodline of the descendants of gods. What the priests offer to Anubis are the divine sins that are obviously distorted. However, those who do not show it, and those whose distorted nature is hidden even deeper, become the children of gods, the noble pharaohs. And some become the concubine of the pharaoh. This kind of divine sin that lives on blood should be awakened when a certain pharaoh came into contact with his concubine's blood. The distorted nature of both sides infected each other and awakened. It is a brand new, relatively stable divine sin. It is also a brand new species, and that pharaoh is the origin of this species. He will have unprecedented power that is comparable to the gods. The blood race of this world is actually born like this." Shintu Gong of the Yama team was secretly shocked. Shintu. Imodin accurately knew the real name of the Yama team leader. He slowly turned his head and said, "I know that you came to follow me for other purposes, but I don't care. There is no loyalty in this world, and I don't ask for loyalty. I will let you do what you want, but you have to consider the risk of disobeying me. Do you understand?" Imodin's eyes seemed to pry open Shintu Gong's brain, making him feel like he was transparent, unable to hide anything. Shintu Gong was shocked. Damn it, what kind of medicine did the 9 provinces give Imodin? Why did he suddenly become so cunning? Without the poison of love, I really wouldn't be able to deal with Imodin. His entire person has ascended. Shintu Gong secretly cursed. Imhotep pondered for a moment and said to Shinagong, "Even if I kill the demon scorpion great emperor and completely control the death bracelet, it will still be difficult to deal with that existence. Therefore, I need some more powerful forces to help me. When I was the high priest, out of pity, I secretly spared the lives of some abominations who were not extremely twisted. It should be because of this that I lost the favor of Anubis. This later became one of the evidence of my crimes. These sons of the pharaoh that I adopted were all sacrificed to Anubis, but I know that they were not devoured by the gods. Instead, they're still sealed in the underworld. These people are loyal to me, and I owe them a favor." Imodin's voice was deep. "Now, my servant Shintu, go and retrieve the black scripture of the undead. I will personally release them and borrow their powerful strength." Shintu Gong said softly, "Yes, His Holiness Imodin." He turned around and walked out of the palace. This was a temple in the desert. This was one of the palaces that Imodin had once used to be the high priest. It had been buried under the yellow sand, and the Yama team had cleared an entrance. Imodin stayed in the temple. Shintu Gong knew very well that Imodin did not want Anubis to know about this, so he needed the Book of the Undead to bypass death and enter the underworld. As for why Imodin did not want Anubis to know about this, Shintu Gong had a guess in his heart. He wanted to kill a god. Kill a god. Shintu Gong smiled slightly. Of course, he would not stop this matter. On the contrary, he would do his best to facilitate it. And Imodin clearly saw this, which was why he said that he was not loyal, but still entrusted this treacherous and dangerous matter to him. This was because Imodin could see very clearly that these reincarnators were filled with greed for benefits. From the depths of their souls, they clamored, "Make a big scoop." For a group of people who wished for the world to be in chaos, it was perfect to leave this matter to them. This was because Imodin himself was wandering on the edge of madness. Sometimes, even Imodin himself did not know what he wanted to do. Was it revenge? Or was it the destruction of everything? Imodin looked at Shintu Gong's back. He was not worried that this person who chased after benefits and chaos would not be able to complete the task. He already knew what Chenong wanted to do. He wanted to kill a god. For this, Chenong would probably raise both hands in support. He had even single-handedly pushed Imodin to this position because of this. Chenong would return the undead Black Sutra to him without revealing anything. Imodin believed this without a doubt. However, he had always concealed one thing. The place where the abominations were sealed in the underworld not only imprisoned the abominations that he had secretly taken in, but also imprisoned the craziest and most twisted abominations that even the gods did not dare to absorb. In fact, the abominations that the gods devoured were the weakest and the least twisted. As for the most twisted and powerful abominations, even the gods did not dare to approach them unless they wanted to lose themselves and become extremely crazy. These abominations were exiled to the deepest part of the underworld when they were at their weakest. If they did not have the permission of the gods, they would never be able to take a step out. After a few thousand years, these abominations would definitely become extremely powerful and could even threaten the gods. The soul behind Imodin's eyes was dark and deep, like an abyss that was deeper than the deepest part of the underworld. He said in a low voice, "The throne in the sky will suddenly fall. The sacred temples of the gods will burn. The gods will wail. They will fall to the earth, and the earth will be devoured by the abyss below. In this disaster, no one will be saved. I will conquer them. I will not fear the darkness, because I am already in the abyss. There is no existence that is darker than me." In front of Imodin was an exquisite coffin. Inside, there was a set of white bones that were made of spices and gold. With a light pinch, the almost rotten white bones would turn into powder. Imodin piously pressed his forehead against the coffin. He wailed in pain and struggled. His soul sank deeper into the abyss. The soul of his former lover, Insuna, was struggling to die. This process was still ongoing. It was like drowning, slow and painful. Chapter 670. O'Connor was already waiting at the port of Giza in Cairo. Evelyn and her brother had just arrived. The port of Giza was the largest port in Cairo. They could reach the estuary delta by following the Nile River and choosing the waterway closest to the Suez Canal. There were many ports in Egypt there, and it was also the exit of the Suez Canal that connected to the Mediterranean Sea. They were going to Port Said, where they would board a British ship that sailed out of the Suez Canal. They would sail through the Strait of Gibraltar to London. There were British troops stationed along the banks of the Suez Canal. O'Connor and the others still did not believe that the Eye of Horus had expanded its influence there. They had no doubt about the power of Britain. Even in Cairo, the Eye of Horus's power had reached an unbridled level. However, O'Connor was still willing to believe that the government of the United Kingdom had control over the Suez Canal. The port of Giza was located on the left bank of the Nile River, opposite the Great Pyramid of Giza. Evelyn stared at the three magnificent pyramids on the other side of the river. In the middle, the tallest Great Pyramid of Giza. Dozens of men in black with the Eye of Horus's swords were guarding the top of the pyramid. Evelyn could vaguely see a mysterious figure on the top of the pyramid. She was not sure if it was an illusion, but she felt that the person was watching them. "O'Connor," Evelyn called out worriedly, "someone is watching us." "Where?" O'Connor took out his binoculars and looked in the direction that Evelyn was pointing. He was surprised to see Chan Ong standing on the top of the pyramid and smiling at them. O'Connor put down the binoculars in panic and turned his head. "There's no one. Let's get on the boat." He hurriedly pulled Evelyn onto the passenger ship. Evelyn felt even more uneasy. She kept looking at the top of the Great Pyramid of Giza and asked doubtfully, "Really? O'Connor, why do I feel that you are lying to me? Someone is watching us." At the top of the Great Pyramid of Giza, Zhang Zicheng hurriedly found Chenong and said, "There must be a reason why Imodin came here 2 days ago. The bracelet of death hides the location of the pyramid built by the great Emperor Scorpion, the coordinates of the Amzi Oasis. It was buried in the ancient temple of Thebes. After it was excavated by Imodin, he had to pass through the pyramid of Giza, the temple of Karnak, the temple of Philae, and the temple of Abu Simbel to obtain further coordinates before locking onto the Amzi oasis. Chenong smiled and said, "When we attacked the Pyramid of Giza 2 days ago, Imidin should have already obtained the other coordinates. Yesterday, we received information that Imidin and the others have excavated another buried temple. It should be the location of another part of the Temple of Karnak. Now, they should be heading to Aswan to find the hidden coordinates of the Temple of Philae. Meanwhile, we have to clear the Suez Canal before we fight Imidin in the Amzi Oasis." Chenong sighed and said, "Even without the Spear of Judgment in our hands, Imidin could still kill the great Emperor Scorpion. However, if we don't add fuel to the fire, wouldn't we be letting go of an opportunity?" Chenong pressed a hidden mechanism in the scepter in his hand. At the end of the scepter, a golden spear tip suddenly appeared. The Spear of Judgment had completely changed its form. Its tip was inlaid with a round diamond. This was the head of the Apollo scepter, which hid the secret of the Ark of the Covenant. The diamond seemed to be condensing the endless light of the sun, and this light was channeled into the tip of the spear below. Chenong gently shook his wrist, and the tip of the Spear of Judgment shot out an incandescent ray, cutting a giant rock hundreds of meters away in half. Taking a closer look at the tip of the Spear of Judgment, it was as if all the sunlight in the surrounding hundreds of meters was concentrated on the tip of the needle. Under the bright light, extreme destruction was brewing. "I left the dark scripture at the top of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Imidin will send someone to retrieve it soon. Don't stop them. As for the trip to the Amzi Oasis, he will wait for us." Zhang Ziqiang was confused. "Why would he wait for us?" "To be precise, he is waiting for the Spear of Judgment in our hands." Chenong explained with great interest. "This is the tacit understanding between me and Imidin. He knows what I want to do, and he is also using me to complete his transformation. For this, he will temporarily endure until he obtains enough power to face me directly with my help. The act of slaying the gods must be carried out. I was truly tired of the foolish gods in this world. They were all so cowardly and secretive, constantly retracting their heads into their shells like frightened turtles. It was time for them to contribute their power to the world. Let those with more potential and vigor take the lead. I have combined the power of the Apollo scepter and the Spear of Judgment, giving this weapon the power to slay gods. When Imidin gets his hands on it, this divine weapon used by the god of death to test his warriors will pierce through his own heart." On the Nile River, the passenger ship carrying O'Connor and Evelyn slowly left the port. Chenong also ordered, "Let's go. It's time to wake up those sleeping imperialists. I want to see if the whetstone I prepared for Imidin can sharpen a god's power. I hope the empire of the unsetting sun will not let me down." On the side of the Great Pyramid of Giza that was facing away from the Nile River, a huge airbag slowly rose. The airship was pure white, equipped with all kinds of heavy weapons and a huge hangar. When the streamlined body of the airship rose from the back of the Great Pyramid of Giza, its magnificent body cast a shadow on both sides of the Nile River. On the opposite side of the river, many Egyptians knelt on the ground. Evelyn stared at the huge airship above her head, dumbfounded. This time, she did not feel the familiar gaze. O'Connell watched as the airship slowly turned around and headed downstream. The passenger and cargo ship that they were on followed behind. They could only watch as the shadow of the airship slowly lengthened on the ground, faintly disappearing into the distance. On the airship, Chenong put away the Spear of Judgment. Li Mingyi and Zhao Yingqi followed behind him to deal with the documents. There were also hundreds of black-clothed Blood Clan providing protection on the airship. A low buzzing sound came from afar. Dozens of modified camel fighter jets took off from Cairo Airport. With the airship as the core formation, the huge aviation battle group flew towards the estuary of the Mediterranean Sea. On the ground, the fleet of the Eye of Horus stretched for several kilometers. A huge army was on an expedition. In the faraway Suez Canal Company, the British army that had been relieved of their garrison duty finally officially entered the barracks today and handed over the garrison duty. After more than a month of investigation, The members of the Suez Canal Company who had accompanied them also officially began the handover and management work. They began to take over the control of the armory, the checkpoints, and the accounting documents. Chapter 671. When the airship appeared on the horizon of Port Said, it was already close to midnight. Chenong looked at the blurry port on the horizon and signaled for the airship to stop. Port Said was currently the second largest port in Egypt. It was located at the northern end of the Suez Canal on the Mediterranean Sea. It was originally a small village and was built with the opening of the Suez Canal in 1859. Just like most cities, this place had a large area of urban slums. Only the port close to the northern exit of the Suez Canal was still brightly lit at midnight. Sailors from various countries who came from the Suez Canal, British soldiers stationed here, as well as white merchants from England, France, and Belgium, as well as sailors and adventurers, were all living a drunken life in this port, joking and laughing. When Chun Ang's airship appeared on the horizon, because Chun Ang ordered the lights on the airship to be switched off, no one noticed the strange white dot on the horizon. In fact, the camel planes that lowered the frequency of their engines were even more hidden. Other than a little humming sound, they were like little shadows in the night sky. Chun Ang stood next to the porthole of the airship with a dozen vampires in black beside him. The camel planes were already silently flying towards Port Said. In the sky above the port, dozens of black figures suddenly descended from the plane. They pounced down from the back seat and glided towards various important locations in Port Said. In the shadows of the city below, there were also many men in black with the symbol of the horses, to receive them. Chun Ang greeted Li Mingyi and the others and had them take over the intelligence and command of Port Said from the airship. Then, with a push of his toes, he pounced out from the airship that was hundreds of meters above the ground. The vampires behind him hurriedly followed. Chun Ang controlled his mana to bind the air around him, forming a flat, aerodynamic shape. Using this, he flew swiftly towards Port Said. The vampires following behind all had large bat wings protruding from their backs. The blood-red bat wings provided them with the tension to glide. Relying on their innate bloodline, they nimbly followed Chun Ang as they traversed the sky above Port Said. Their speed was exceedingly fast. Occasionally, some of them would raise their heads to look at the sky, but they could only see a few shadows flitting past. Most of them would only think that their eyes were playing tricks on them. A British Marine stared dumbfoundedly at a few gigantic shadows flitting past his head with a whistling sound. Half drunk and half sober, he opened his mouth wide in astonishment and asked his companions behind him, "Did you guys see that?" Unfortunately, the moment his voice left his mouth, it was completely absorbed by a wide palm. He could only hear a soft hush by his ear, and a pair of iron pincer-like arms tightly bound him. The Marine was still struggling, but he felt an ice-cold blade piercing into his heart through the gap between his ribs. Large amounts of blood flowed out from his body. Before he died, the Marine could feel the dagger in his body devouring his blood hungrily. Soon, he lost consciousness. Chun Ang's speed was raised to an extreme level. He had also lowered his height to around 20 meters. For the last distance, he glided through the winding alleys of Port Said, shuttling through the crisscrossing alleys as fast as lightning. His target was the most conspicuous building in Port Said, which was also the official residence of the British High Commissioner in Egypt. The British soldier who was on sentry duty at the entrance of the official residence was knocked to the ground by a dark shadow descending from the sky. His blood-curdling scream startled the nearby patrolling squads of British soldiers. When they were attracted by the commotion at the entrance, they did not notice the dark shadow above them. A black-clothed vampire charged into their midst, using the momentum to knock down a group of British soldiers. The scimitar in his hand swiftly slashed across their chins, rising and falling like an elegant dance. In a few breaths, he had slaughtered the 9-man patrol squad. Fresh blood nourished his dried-up wellspring, causing the bloody glow on his bat wings to thicken. The unique thermal vision of the vampires allowed them to easily detect the heat waves of humans. Furthermore, these vampires were known as blood sniffers, allowing them to figure out the number of people and defensive arrangements in the building from hundreds of meters away. Dozens of dark shadows swiftly took their positions according to their mission, killing everyone who stood in their way. When one of Chun Ang's feet stepped onto the marble floor of the official residence, he was like a nimble eagle. With a small turn, he dispelled the enormous kinetic energy and stood firmly on the ground. Two vampire guards opened the door for him. They first went forward to clear the way, while Chenong followed behind them slowly. The two vampire guards rushed forward like phantoms and killed the two guards who came to investigate after hearing the commotion outside. From the windows and windowsills, more vampires entered the luxurious official residence in an orderly manner. The British High Commissioner in Egypt was like the emperor of the whole of Egypt. This commissioner was sent here by the British after Commissioner Wingate in Cairo was transformed into a vampire by the Eye of Horus. He temporarily lived in the property of the Suez Canal Company. The vampires surrounded the official residence, blocked the exit, and quickly took over the luxurious official residence. At this time, Chun Ong led a group of vampire guards through the white walnut door. He stepped on the high-quality cashmere carpet produced in Egypt and walked toward the master's reception room. The official residence was generally European in style, but with a strong Egyptian flavor. The reception room was also arranged according to the British tradition. Outside the reception room, the attendants of the British High Commissioner were still fiercely resisting. The two Indian servants who were proficient in yoga were extremely difficult to deal with. They had strong spirits and tough bodies. Because they were proficient in yoga and ancient Indian martial arts, their bodies could be bent into all kinds of incredible shapes at any time to use all kinds of strange moves. One of the vampire guards beside Chun Ong leaped onto the ceiling with a slight push from the wall beside him. Like a giant bat, he twisted the scimitar in his hand and twisted the hilt upside down, wrapping around the throat of a Sikh servant like a viper. Then he twisted the scimitar with both hands, and a head flew into the air. Without the slightest hesitation, he lifted his leg and kicked the corpse away. At the same time, the scimitar in his hand cut through the air, drawing a strange curve in the air and cutting the throat of the second person. The angry roar of the British High Commissioner came from the reception room. "Who are you?" Several guards were blocking the entrance of the guest room. They had already repelled 2 waves of attacks from the bloodbreeds, and they had paid a terrible price for it. There were several corpses on the ground, and the injured bloodbreeds had already recovered with the blood of the other guards in the official residence. Chenong stepped on the Indian's corpse and slowly walked toward the reception room. He said in a deep voice, "You should know us, High Commissioner. Aren't you looking for us? Now we are here." Chapter 672. The Commissioner and the important members of the Suez Canal Company, who were trapped in the reception room, looked at each other. The guards protecting them suddenly became violent. The most frightening thing was the 2 arrows that were shot from tricky angles. The speed and sharpness of the arrows made Chun Ong suddenly feel a sense of vigilance. He pressed his right hand on his waist, and a translucent silver fan with a radius as long as a sword flashed by. The 2 arrows were split in half from the middle, and they fell to the ground. At this time, the silver sword light in the air dissipated, and the British finally saw the weapon in Chun Ang's right hand. It was a flexible sword that could even be wrapped around the waist. The sword light was as clear as water, and the sword body was tough. It was straight and shiny in Chun Ang's hand. No one could imagine that this sword was just wrapped around Chun Ang's waist with a relatively large curve. English longbowmen. Chenong looked at the 2 British soldiers behind the commissioner. The purple-wood longbows in their hands revealed their identity. This kind of strange body with an extremely strong upper body and deformed chest and backbones reminded people of the English longbowmen before the British Industrial Revolution. They fought against the invasion and made the invaders of the European continent tremble with fear. But Chenong did not expect that this kind of ancient soldier was still preserved by the British in today's era of hot and cold weapons. At this time, the 2 British soldiers who rushed out of the reception room had already arrived in front of Chenong. Although they were wearing the British military uniform, Their yellow skin and the distinctive characteristics of the Highlanders all showed that these soldiers were not British. In their hands, the strange weapons that looked like dog legs showed their identity. These people holding Nepalese scimitars were the Gurkha warriors who had once dealt a huge blow to the British army. After the British conquered the Gurkhas, they hired a large number of these Gurkha warriors who were good at fighting to participate in suppressing the uprising against colonial rule in India. The Gurkha warriors were disciplined, brave, and good at fighting. The physique of the Highlanders made them tough. They believed in Hinduism and advocated ascetic rituals, which gave them a strong will to endure pain. The two scimitars mercilessly slashed at Chun Ang's vital points. These Gurkha warriors had extremely high pain tolerance, and their reaction to pain was almost slow. They were skilled in martial arts, and most importantly, they were not afraid of death. They were often willing to die together with the enemy. These two Gurkha warriors were the best of the best. After some mysterious Hindu rituals, they were proficient in yoga, and their bodies were abnormally agile. They also had extraordinary strength. Their strength was no less than that of the vampires. Of course, if the two sides fought head-on, the final victory would be the vampires because the vampires had an almost immortal recovery ability. And the Gurkha warriors were still human. The long sword in Chun Ang's hand bent slightly under his control. The blade drew a curve, accumulating elastic kinetic energy. The tip of the sword swayed with the curve of the blade. In Chun Ang's hand, this extremely difficult-to-use weapon was as flexible as a vicious poisonous snake. In the time that Chun Ang took a step forward, he had cut a deep wound on the wrists of the two Gurkha warriors. The wound was so deep that the bone could be seen. The scimitars could no longer control their momentum and flew out of the hands of the Gurkha warriors. The sword flashed again, and the two men's faces were cut by the tip of the sword. The wound swept past their eyes and cut the eyeballs under the eyelids in half. The Gurkha warriors clenched their teeth and endured the sharp pain in their eyes. They still wanted to fight, but Chun Ang had already passed them. The vampires behind him quickly dragged the two who had lost their sight away. At this time, Chun Ang was only 5 steps away from the British commissioner. He stepped forward with his sword in hand, and the long sword in his hand was pulled out like a dragon from his sleeve. He casually stabbed a British soldier who came to stop him. A black-robed clergyman next to the British commissioner pressed one hand on the Bible and hurriedly chanted Latin scriptures. He turned the front of the cross to Chun Ang. The cross was made of gold and inlaid with gems. It emitted a bright, holy light. The vampire behind Chun Ang let out a muffled groan. His skin that was exposed to the holy light seemed to be burned. Large pieces of skin fell off and were charred. The other 3 barefoot black soldiers quickly rushed forward. These Maasai warriors were hired by the British from the most warlike tribe in Africa. They were tall and unusually strong, and the spears in their hands were unusually flexible. The 3 of them cooperated seamlessly, sometimes attacking separately, sometimes attacking together, some luring the enemy, and some fighting back. The 3 of them seemed to have merged into one, and it was difficult to defend against them. If it was a vampire standing here, when they were suddenly attacked by the holy light, even if it was Hong Fan, he would be at a great disadvantage. Unfortunately, it was not Hong Fan standing here. Chun Ang reached down with his left hand, and a silver P229 fell into his palm. The long sword in his right hand moved along with his wrist, and the edge of the blade trembled like a flower, but there was a hidden sharpness hidden in it. He could always stab the enemy's vital parts in an unhurried manner. At the same time, his left hand fired continuously, calmly killing the 2 longbowmen who posed a threat behind him. He did not stop walking, killing everything in his way, leaving a ground full of corpses, until he arrived in front of the British commissioner. At this time, the vampires at the back who were blinded by the holy light had also recovered. They absorbed the blood of the people around them and quickly recovered. Several people had already followed Chun Ang in. The clergyman in black wanted to resist, and the cross in his hand was preparing a fierce counterattack, but his neck was slit by Chun Ang. The blood from his neck touched the body of a black-clothed vampire behind Chun Ang, causing him to go berserk. He roared and pounced into the center of the reception room. The expression of the important personnel of Suez in the middle changed drastically, and they tried to stop him with a series of shots, but he was as fast as the wind. In the blink of an eye, he appeared next to them and grabbed the necks of two of them. His fingernails that carried blood energy had already pierced into their arteries. Seeing that Chunong was already standing in front of him, the British commissioner hurriedly shouted, "You can't kill me. I'm a hereditary baron of Great Britain. If you kill me, you'll be in big trouble even if you're a vampire. As long as you let me go, I'll tell you everything about the Empire." Chunong's expression was indifferent. "No need, we'll get it ourselves." He stepped aside, and the vampire baron behind him suddenly looked up from his hood. His pale face gave him a unique, evil aura, but the British commissioner obviously recognized him. He screamed in horror like a little girl, "Wingate, the former commissioner of Egypt, Wingate." His voice was filled with fear and a hint of surprise. Since Wingate had been transformed into a member of the Blood Clan, it proved that his fate was probably the same. Although he would lose a lot of power and benefits after being transformed into a member of the Blood Clan, at least he would be able to live and enjoy eternal life. Therefore, when Wingate bit his throat, he did not have the slightest intention of resisting. Very soon, the commissioner turned into a dry corpse and was thrown to the ground by Wingate like garbage. Wingate knelt on the ground and reported, "Master, I've read his memory and know the British plan." Chapter 673. The Suez Canal meandered through the barren land. Along both sides of the canal was a 104-kilometer-long, 8-kilometer-wide military base. Since 1875, when the Egyptian government had to sell 44% of the Suez Canal's shares to Britain at a low price, Britain's largest overseas garrison was stationed here. In order to protect the interests of the canal, Britain maintained its largest overseas military base here. In the future, during World War II, Britain would use this as its core. At most, there would be 15 divisions of land, 65 air squadrons, and the entire Royal Navy of the Eastern Mediterranean stationed here. It was the headquarters of Britain's operations in the East. The flag of the International Suez Canal Company fluttered everywhere on the canal. The annual revenue from crossing the river was several times the national income of Egypt, and its strategic significance was unimaginably great. In fact, it had become a country within a country of Britain and Egypt. It was also one of Britain's most important overseas interests. Its importance could completely trigger a world war. Britain had so many troops stationed here, and the system was so strict that even with the infiltration ability of Horus's eye, it was difficult to completely control the entire military base. Since the International Suez Canal Company sent a delegation to the military base yesterday, the new British High Commissioner in Egypt, Baron Fumoy, took over all the security and military police systems of the base. He sealed off the armory and oil depots and kept a tight watch on the ammunition. All the firearms of the garrison were less useful than a broken fire stick. The soldiers from Britain took over most of the important positions, and the military base was in a state of panic. However, Baron Fumoy's methods were superb. First, he used pay as an excuse to dull the soldiers' resistance. On the other hand, he used inspection as an excuse to force the soldiers to accept military management. At noon the next day, he cut off the communication between the soldiers and searched the huge military base one by one. "Baron, the army is ready," a clerk wearing a wig said to a short noble. Baron Fumoy slowly turned back. He had a pair of amber eyes and looked quite young. However, it had to be said that he maintained himself well, so he still looked like a young man. Baron Fumoy's temperament was slightly feminine, and his every move was worthy of being a noble. He was the kind of person who integrated etiquette and manners into his bones. He was the true foundation of Britain's old imperial power. Even if Chunong was here, he had to admit that this kind of person was the representative of the true elites of this space-time. Ever since the British Industrial Revolution, the country's power had risen. It had colonized the entire world for hundreds of years, usurped countless elites from all over the world, and accumulated a rich heritage and talent. The Great Voyage era had left the British aristocrats with the ruthlessness and greed in their bones, the pride and sharpening of an empire where the sun never sets, and the vision and accumulation of colonizing the entire world. In this era, although the British were slightly weakened after the First World War, their bones were not destroyed by the Second World War, and they still had the geographical aura to dominate the world. On the one hand, London's extravagance and ostentatious decadence were indicative of the twilight of the empire where the sun never sets. On the other hand, politicians and elites like Baron Fermoy were indicative of the empire's heritage. It was them who used all kinds of political tricks and arrangements to push the United States out of the League of Nations. It was also them who blocked the claws of the United States that reached out to the empire, leading to the peak of North American isolationism. It was also them who reversed the tide of colonial revolts set off during the First World War, using clever and vicious methods to train the disobedient colonies. Behind Baron Fermoy stood an old priest in a red robe. His half-closed eyes made him look like an old man. But only the guards who followed Baron Fermoy knew how terrifying the influence of this ordinary-looking old man was. As the Archbishop of York of the Puritan Church of England, this old man had the same authority as the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Anglican Church of England, Church of England. The old bishop nodded slightly to Baron Fermoy and said, "The intelligence is correct. There's indeed the scent of those dark creatures here. We have already locked onto most of them. The infiltration of those vampires into the Empire's army has reached a very dangerous level." Baron Fermoy seemed to be angered by this. He said in a deep voice, "If the Queen did not send me here, would we have lost control of this place? How bad would the situation have gotten? We can already confirm that a vampire organization called the Eye of Horus has infiltrated the army and even has a strong influence on Egypt. Fortunately, we have already taken control of the situation before it got worse. Those vampires' control over the army has not reached a critical point yet. Now that we have successfully taken over most of the power here and separated them, we have the situation under control. Next, the matters of screening and handling will be handled by the church." Hearing this, the old bishop smiled and nodded slightly, indicating his approval. "As for us, we will take over the reorganization of the Suez Canal Company and focus on the Eye of Horus," Baron Fermoy ordered. His subordinate, Sir Edmund, reported, "Then should we start the operation now?" Baron Fermoy shook his head. "Look at the sky. It is midnight. Do you want us to clean up a group of vampires that are almost impossible to kill under the moon at midnight? Even an idiot knows that they will be at their weakest tomorrow at noon." "Sir, you mean to say that we will start the operation tomorrow at noon?" Sir Edmund asked carefully. "I said that even an idiot knows. Are you an idiot? Don't those vampires know that they are at their weakest at noon? Won't they be on guard because of this?" Baron Fermoy mocked. Seeing Sir Edmund's confused look, he helplessly tidied up his appearance and ordered, "We will start the operation tomorrow morning. When the sun is completely in the sky, we will start. At that time, the vampires will not be as vigilant as they are at noon, nor will they be as sharp as when the sun is out. They will fall into a period of psychological dullness." "Yes, sir." Sir Edmund hurriedly lowered his head. The camp of tens of thousands of soldiers would not be crammed together. In fact, it was a very large area. The different areas were divided in an orderly manner, and the army was stationed in different areas according to the battalion level. The regiments were even further apart. The entire military base was like a sparsely distributed city, which made it easier for Baron Fermoy to lock down the area. The checkpoints between the camps had already been taken over by the local army, and the gendarmerie was also under his control. Now he could cut off the communication between the battalions at any time and gradually clean them up. In fact, that was what he was doing. Dozens of black-robed clergymen had already followed the cardinal to the various camps in the central area of the base. In name, they were there to pray for the soldiers. This was very common in the British Army, and there was nothing to criticize. Just like that, the chains silently tightened around the throats of the Eye of Horus vampires. Chapter 674. Chinong took out a small box from the waist of the insect, which contained the investments of other samsara teams. Listening carefully, you can hear the rustling sound coming from inside. Chinong smiled slightly. This thing was a surprise. He didn't expect that the samsara travelers would bring such a thing, which greatly advanced his plan. He didn't plan to attack the United Kingdom so soon. He opened the box and found a strange golden insect inside. It was shaped like a snail, pure gold, with 3 rows of buttons and a walkie-talkie on the top of the shell. It looked very strange. This creature is a strange creature in the world of One Piece that can communicate with electromagnetic waves, Den Den Mushi. The pair of Den Den Mushi handed over by the samsara travelers are divided into 2 colors, gold and silver. It is a special breed, specially cultivated by the Marines to issue exorcism orders. It has a special status in the world of One Piece. Of course, in other worlds, it is too impractical. This kind of creature, worth tens of thousands of reward points, can be completely replaced by a satellite phone that can be exchanged with a few points. The golden Den Den Mushi is more precious than the ordinary Den Den Mushi. The call is hidden and the communication frequency is very special. Only the corresponding Den Den Mushi can receive it, and the communication mileage is powerful. It can almost cross the whole world without worrying about signal problems. But in modern society, it can be solved by digital encryption of long-wave signals, and the cost does not exceed 5 reward points. Therefore, this is the idle resource in the hands of the samsara travelers. It is extremely difficult to trade it, but the value is very precious. The samsara travelers who kept it also gave it to Chunong for capital operation because it was too weak. It seems that Chunong is at a great disadvantage, but is this really the case? Chunong doesn't think so. On the contrary, he values this game very much, because Den Den Mushi is a creature. The precious thing about creatures is that it is a rich information bank in science and excellent raw materials. These special creatures may have great potential after biochemical transformation. Therefore, Den Den Mushi quickly became an important project in Chunong's laboratory. Den Den Mushi, like normal carbon-based organisms, need to drink, eat, and even get sick. Chunong quickly used this characteristic to isolate its relevant genes from the silver Den Den Mushi using retroviruses. Using genomics and functional research methods, he found the genes related to the electromagnetic waves emitted by Den Den Mushi cells. The reason why the Den Den Mushi has the ability to communicate remotely is that there's a functional cell in its cells that has an extremely powerful electromagnetic interference ability. The evolution of this unique cell in the biological world gives it the basic ability to emit and receive electromagnetic waves. And this kind of cell, Chunong had only seen in another biological test subject, and that was Magneto. But unlike the X gene, this kind of cell has a very big defect in energy level. The Den Den Mushi can only emit some long and short waves with all its strength, and it has little ability to harm living beings. Even if Chunong tries his best to strengthen it, he can only make it emit some small electric current, which is far from a humanoid electromagnetic weapon like Magneto. But Chunong had a lot of experience in the development of biological weapons, and he quickly perceived the most potential point. Since the quality can't be improved, then he will start from the quantity. The strength of this creature lies in the ability to conduct and accept electromagnetic waves, not in its power. Its role should be a huge electromagnetic wave generator. Its biggest weakness is that the cells do not have the ability to withstand strong electrical energy. Magneto's cells can accept a strong energy infusion, but the current of the Den Den Mushi will kill its cells. So Chunong first started from here, using retroviruses to screen the relevant genes, and using the vampire virus to create bacteria with abnormally strong vitality. Then using retroviruses as a tool, the relevant functional genes of Den Den Mushi were grafted into the vampire bacteria. Using this extremely strong vitality, it can overcome many extreme cycles. It can survive normally up to the escape layer and down to the mantle. It carried the functional genes of the relevant biochemical weapons. In the end, Chunong successfully cultivated what he wanted, the superbacteria that can carry more electricity, the electromagnetic tower bacteria. Its unique organelles, electrical mitochondria, can convert and receive electromagnetic waves, and can use electromagnetic waves to sustain life, polymerize nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, and multiply. In this process, Chun-Ong used the genetic map of some carbon-based bacteria on gas planets to create this superbacteria that can divide and reproduce in the atmosphere. In the end, the bacteria colony cultivated in the laboratory was launched into the ionosphere with the portable satellite launching device brought by the Samsara travelers. With the help of the abundant free electron energy and ionized gas there, the bacteria could divide and reproduce. The experiment failed twice, but only 2 weeks ago it succeeded. Now, the bacteria in the ionosphere had multiplied and divided to a large extent. The volume of these bacteria adds up to the size of 90 blue whales. Although they are evenly distributed over North Africa, covering Egypt and part of the Arabian Peninsula, the unique electromagnetic communication mode allows them to connect with each other as if they are one. They form a huge electromagnetic communication network. On the ground, only the golden din mushi in Chun-Ang's hand can control them. This electromagnetic network is part of the Earth control system conceived by Chun-Ong, and it is also the carrier of the space-based weapons being developed. This huge electromagnetic network in the energy-rich ionosphere is not only expected to be part of the energy network of the future Earth control system, but also the energy source of the space-based weapons developed by Chun-Ong. The golden din mushy cells were also embedded by Chun-Ong into the body of the vampire octopus as part of the entire system, achieving sea-air network access. As Chun-Ong quickly pressed a few keys in the din mushy in his hand, a series of complex electromagnetic wave information flow was transmitted into the ionosphere 60 kilometers above Chun-Ang's head. The electromagnetic bacteria cloud, covering all of Egypt and most of the Arabian Peninsula, subtly adjusted the intensity and frequency of the battery wave, and the free electrons in the ionosphere were emitted to the low-altitude water vapor layer above Chun-Ang's head. The static electricity in the air suddenly increased exponentially. Chun-Ong looked at his slightly erect hair and silently calculated the amount of charge in the air. The rapidly increasing charge has caused friction and attraction of water vapor, and large pieces of clouds instantly enveloped the area along the Suez Canal. Baron Fermoy, who was waiting for the sunrise, looked at the dark clouds gathering in the sky doubtfully. The prelude to this storm seemed a bit strange, but he did not feel any traces of magic interference. Even the old bishop did not notice it. There seemed to be a huge force in the air, but this kind of natural force did not seem to be worth paying attention to. So although Baron Fermoy felt a little strange, he still ignored this dangerous sign. For Chun-Ong, this was just a prelude. The thunderstorm power accumulated in the sky was just a prelude. It was to trigger a more powerful force later on. In 1899, Nikola Tesla tried to use the ionosphere to transmit energy wirelessly over long distances. He sent extremely low-frequency waves between the ground and the so-called Knorley-Heisel layer of the ionosphere, trying to trigger the resonance of the ionosphere and achieve the infinite transmission of huge energy. Some people said that the Tunguska explosion that occurred in 1908 was the weaponized use of this achievement. In the Red Alert world, the Allies' ultimate weapon, the weather controller that could trigger lightning storms, was developed based on this achievement. Now the thunderstorm that was accumulating in the air could provide coordinates for the next space-based electromagnetic weapon strike. The thunderstorm was equivalent to a huge Tesla electromagnetic tower, triggering a direct attack from the ionosphere. The effect could be earth-shattering. Chun-Ong was confident that he could wipe the entire military base off the map in the first place. Unfortunately, after triggering a space-based thunderstorm, the electromagnetic bacteria in the air will overload and lose a lot of energy. It will take at least a week before it can be used again. If we want to use it in the same place, we'll have to wait for another 3 weeks until the bacteria above the ionosphere have multiplied enough, Chun-Ong sighed. But even so, this is still a powerful trump card. This time, the British Army is only a basic experiment to verify the basic functions. It's not time to launch an all-out attack yet. That's for Imidin. The thunderstorm was gradually forming in the sky. Baron Fermoy looked calmly at the dark clouds above his head. Beside him, Sir Edmund whispered, "Sir, In this weather, the vampires may be able to maintain most of their fighting power. Should we delay the operation a little? Baron Fermoy raised his hand to stop him from saying anything else. Proceed according to plan. Although the weather factor is unexpected, the risk will be greater if the plan is delayed. With sufficient preparations on our side, the vampires will definitely not be able to turn the tables. Everything is still under control. Chapter 675. The night before dawn, it was still raining cats and dogs. Time passed slowly. It was supposed to be sunrise, but the sky was still dark. Baron Fermoy looked up and saw that the sky was covered by dark clouds. The sky was as dark as twilight, and he could only hear the sound of flowing water. The curtain of rain covered his eyes and the horizon. On the vast Suez Canal, the liner slowly passed by him. The whistle of the steam engine woke up many of the British soldiers who were still asleep. Baron Fermoy said coldly, "Time's up." He put on his raincoat and took out a black umbrella from the door of his office. He walked into the rain, his black boots stepping on the muddy water, splashing nearly a foot high. The rain washed everything in front of him, converging into a muddy stream, forming puddles of muddy water in the open space of the camp. Even Baron Fermoy couldn't help but step in the mud. He came to the center of the camp, where a considerable number of British soldiers were already busy. They carried real guns and ammunition, and a few drivers braved the heavy rain to repair a few military transport trucks. The rest were already lined up, ready to go at any time. Among these soldiers, there was a row of black-robed clergymen. They were solemn, silent, and orderly. Dozens of them stood together without making a sound, which made Baron Fermoy nod his head. As expected of the elites of the Church of the Saints, priests who fought against dark creatures all year round. The old bishop, supported by a servant, came from behind. He saw Baron Fermoy's serious face and said, "If it's this kind of weather, the strength of those vampires won't be weakened much, and the rain will bring chaos and trouble." Baron Fermoy said in a low voice, "We'll minimize the trouble." The old bishop glared at him and snorted, "Don't underestimate the dark creatures. If they can survive the pursuit of humans, they must have something worth looking at. In the process of Great Britain's conquest of the world, we've seen too many incredible things. Evil gods worshipped by the natives, hidden evil creatures, dangerous black magic, and so on. There are too many, but the thing that appeared in Cairo not long ago is one of the most difficult I've ever seen. The greatest high priest of ancient Egypt, Imidin. Ever since the curse was resurrected, he's become even more terrifying. But there's still someone in Cairo who can fight him. This person should be the mastermind behind the Eye of Horus we're looking for. Be careful of him. Even though we have brought with us almost half of the Holy Duke's forces, as well as the Gurkha mercenary camp, the mysterious existences we control and employ, you still have to be careful. This is a message from the Lord. May the Lord bless us. May the Lord bless us." Baron Fermoy said in a low voice. Dozens of black-robed clergy boarded the transport vehicles. Several trucks were neatly loaded with hundreds of British soldiers, many of whom were chosen from the colonies. Dozens of cavalrymen rushed out first. They were responsible for guarding the convoy and clearing the path in the heavy rain. There were also dozens of short native soldiers passing through the forest on both sides. The convoy slowly drove along the road of the base towards their target. The African mercenaries with spears and bows in their hands ran vigorously on both sides of the road. They were extremely fast, stepping on the muddy water with their bare feet. Their speed was actually not slower than the trucks beside them. The soldiers moved forward in the rain, but the rain couldn't obstruct their vision. As for the cavalry that followed the convoy, they carried damison-shaped machetes on their waists. Their bodies rose and fell as the horses galloped. Their eyes were sharp, and their aura was awe-inspiring. There was no doubt that they could pull out the machetes at their waists at any time and tear the enemies in front of them to pieces. Their destination was a camp not far from the main camp. The black-robed priests had already locked onto a large number of officers who had been turned into vampires. Under the cover of the heavy rain, they would clear out these heavily damaged areas one by one. Chun Ong stood on the bow of the whistling passenger ship, slowly moving downstream. From the Suez Canal, he could see Baron Fermoy's convoy moving side by side with them. Chenong looked at the people traveling with them. At this time, they were already close to the camp. Baron Fermoy's men were at the entrance of the camp. He saw the Baron sitting in the passenger seat of the truck and opened the gate without saying a word, letting the convoy in. The commotion alerted the British soldiers in the camp. They watched nervously as Baron Fermoy jumped out of the truck in the rain without even taking an umbrella. Then, elite gendarmes jumped out of the back of the truck and formed up behind Baron Fermoy. What surprised the soldiers was that there was a group of priests in black robes following behind them. Baron Fermoy looked at the soldiers poking their heads out of the barracks and shouted, "Now, for the sake of Great Britain's national security and counter-espionage mission, we have concrete evidence that there are German spies hiding in this camp. All soldiers are forbidden from entering or leaving the barracks. All of you are to stay in your barracks. Those who leave their barracks without permission will be dealt with according to military law. Those who resist with firearms will be executed on the spot. All of you are to stay in your beds. When the gendarmes enter, put your hands behind your head and lie down with your backs to the door. You're not allowed to communicate or spy on others. Your only task now is to lie in bed with your hands behind your head. Otherwise, the gendarmes will have the right to execute you." The messenger loudly repeated Baron Fermoy's orders. The soldiers following the Baron had already split into small teams and entered the camp to patrol. They first herded the soldiers who were still outside the barracks into the barracks and guarded the various checkpoints and doors. When Baron Fermoy stepped into the barracks, these small teams had already broken into the first barracks. The captain of the gendarmes looked at the roster in his hands and said to an officer in the barracks, "Are you Chief Warrant Officer Heyman?" Heyman stood up from his bed and looked at the gendarmes. "Yes, Your Excellency." "What's wrong?" "Please come with us." The captain of the gendarmes said expressionlessly. Heyman didn't utter a word. Instead, he looked at the black-robed clergyman behind him and sneered in a low voice, "Looks like you've discovered us." The gendarmes immediately tightened their grip on their guns. The priest who Heyman was staring at also pressed his right hand against the Bible on his chest. After a moment of hesitation, he opened his mouth and said, At this moment, an officer behind Heyman suddenly burst forth. He buried his head and rushed forward like a wild boar. Before the gendarmes could even react, he heavily smashed into their bodies. The gendarmes could clearly hear the sound of their own bones breaking. The black-robed clergyman, who was being protected by everyone, felt a pain in his chest. A sweet smell of blood gushed out from his lungs. He pulled out the cross dagger at his waist and fiercely pressed it down. Just as he was about to stab into the body of the exploding officer, Heyman had already jumped up high and pounced on him. Sharp claws instantly tore open his artery, while Heyman leaned over his neck and gulped down large mouthfuls of his blood. At the same time, the other member of the blood tribe had already massacred all of the gendarmerie. Heyman rushed out of the room with the corpses as gunshots rang out from all directions. However, the majority of the shots were blocked by the corpses in front of him. Occasionally, one or two of the bullets would slip through the net and pierce into Heyman's body. However, they were quickly squeezed out by his regenerating muscles. Heyman pounced towards the most junk in the barracks, intending to use the cover to escape. At this moment, a white light shot out from behind and struck his back. Heyman let out a blood-curdling scream before turning into ashes in the white light. The other vampire who had cooperated with him to escape was also struck in the heart by a silver bullet that had been soaked in holy water. Heyman's resistance seemed to have drawn the curtains of a riot. Dozens of vampires chose to suddenly attack at this moment. Some of them were immediately killed by the gendarmes, but most of them were massacred by the gendarmes. However, the black-robed clergyman found an opportunity. Baron Fermoy calmly looked at the riot that had broken out in the barracks. He only dispatched snipers when the enemies rushed out of the barracks. However, this was, after all, a minority. Most of the vampires were successfully confined to a relatively small space. The black-robed clergyman killed the exposed vampires with astonishing efficiency. Chapter 676. The Suez military base was shrouded in heavy rain at night. O'Connell and the rest were wading through the muddy water. After they disembarked at Port Said, they didn't directly take the boat to London. Instead, they headed towards the British military base in Suez. When O'Connell was a British officer, he had served in this military base for a few years. He could not bear to see the British officers and soldiers here fall under the claws of the devil, so he hired a local carriage overnight. Unexpectedly, when they arrived nearby, the Suez Canal suddenly rained heavily, forcing them to abandon the carriage. Jonathan, who was following behind, complained, "In my opinion, that man is a good man who keeps his word. They gave us what we deserve. We're already rich. O'Connor, we can live a noble's life in Britain now. Why do we have to take the risk here? I hate taking risks. If we die, won't all the gold that I've won be given to others? A good man who installed a bomb in your leg?" O'Connor sneered. "That's very excessive." Jonathan was stunned for a moment before nodding. "But compared to those greedy and ruthless people, he's not bad. At least he gave us the promised gold and let us go." "Greedy? Are you talking about yourself, brother?" Evelyn stepped on the mud with difficulty. With O'Connor's help, she jumped over a puddle of water. After she stood firm, she turned around and said, "And he killed a lot of people. In Cairo, in Hamyonata, in the whole of Egypt. I'm afraid those ruthless people that you said have not seen as many people as they have killed." So, Jonathan spread his hands. "That's why we have to warn those damned bureaucrats that such a terrifying force has appeared in Egypt." O'Connell said that he knew a lot of people when he was an officer in Suez. "Maybe we can alert those people, and we could take a boat to London from here." As she spoke, she looked back at Jonathan in surprise. "You can't be thinking that we can bring so much gold on board so easily, right? They will check our luggage, and when we reach the sea, those lawless sailors will sink us into the Mediterranean Sea. Without O'Connor, we won't be able to transport the gold, and we can't just sit back and watch innocent people die in front of us." Jonathan looked around, especially at the coachman leading the way. O'Connor said, "Stop looking. I deliberately chose a local who doesn't speak English. He can only understand our hand gestures." Jonathan then said in a low voice, "I know a lot of ways to get on the ship without checking the luggage. As long as we guard the luggage closely, there will be no problem. Let's not get sucked into those damn whirlpools again. If I had nothing, I wouldn't mind, but we're rich now. I don't want to bring a huge amount of wealth with me and fall into hell with regret." At this time, Jonathan realized that O'Connor and Evelyn were looking at him in silence. Evelyn looked at him and shook her head slightly. "We can't get rid of this whirlpool because we have long been in it. This is fate. Even if we run to London, the High Priest Imodin and those people will still appear in front of us. Our struggle is as ridiculous as trying to get rid of the shadow under the sun. Because all of this is because of us." After saying that, Evelyn once again sped up, ignoring the blank expression on Jonathan's face, and went to the Suez military base in front of them. Soon, they came to the sentry post at the entrance of the military base. O'Connor went to the guard to inquire, while Evelyn and Jonathan stayed where they were. They waited outside for a while, and someone came to pick them up. A bearded officer shouted to O'Connor from afar, "Hey, O'Connor, my old friend, I heard you retired?" O'Connor introduced to them, "This is Jacob, my comrade in arms and good friend. Jacob, I need to board a ship from here to London, and we have to warn you about something. Do you know the symbol of the Eye of Horus?" Jacob's expression changed instantly. He looked behind him cautiously, then leaned in close to O'Connell's face and pressed down on his neck. With his back facing the sentinel, he whispered, "Damn it, how do you know about this thing? Listen, O'Connor, you must not say that name here. The military camp is no longer under our control. A group of noble officers from London has taken control of the situation, and now I have no power. They're here to deal with the organization you mentioned. In my opinion, sooner or later, there will be a massacre here. Don't get involved in this muddy water." After listening to this shocking news, O'Connor was silent for a moment and suddenly said firmly, "Where is that noble officer? You want to bring us to see him. Are you crazy? When they kill people, they don't care if you're British or not, and they don't treat us as their own people. but we have something important to talk to him about. O'Connell said, "It's about the Eye of Horus, the things that happened in Cairo, Hamunaptra, and many other things. If you don't tell them about these things, you will be in a very dangerous situation. You will be in a very dangerous situation. You don't know your opponent well enough." Jacob listened and stared at O'Connor. He saw determination in O'Connor's eyes and said helplessly, "Fine, I'll bring you there. I hope you don't come out lying down. That would be too sad." Ignoring Jonathan's protest, O'Connor took a few people to an off-road vehicle and drove to Baron Fermoy's camp. Jacob took them through a few checkpoints, but in the end, they were stopped at the entrance of the camp. O'Connor went up to negotiate, but when he saw half a battalion of nervous soldiers inside the checkpoint, he didn't think the result of his negotiation would be good. Sure enough, after a while, Jacob came back and said, "They told us to wait here. The Baron will come out in a while." O'Connor heard the fierce gunshots and screams coming from inside the camp. He felt very depressed and turned his head to look at the Suez Canal. A large ship was slowly flowing down the river, and on the bow, O'Connor thought he saw a familiar figure. He asked Jacob for a pair of binoculars, and when he really saw the figure on the ship, O'Connor screamed. No. Chapter 677. O'Connor saw Chun-Ong glide across the water like a swallow before the two collided, gliding towards the camp. His figure was dragged by some small silver light, and upon closer inspection, it could be seen that it was some fine lightning. The moment he stepped onto the embankment, a dazzling bolt of lightning suddenly struck down from behind. In the heavy rain, a blurry shadow, dragging a faint mist behind it, shot towards the camp. The soldiers on guard inside raised their guns and pointed in the direction of the collision. When Baron Foy heard the noise and came out, he just happened to see Chun-Ong wrapped in countless interweaving lightning bolts, descending from the sky like a god of thunder. The vigorous native mercenaries gathered their courage and went forward to stop him, while the soldiers used the fortifications to try and stop his advance. But it was all in vain. Small lightning chains jumped between the soldiers, and as Chun-Ong gently waved them, the electric snakes were like long whips, radiating from his palms into countless long lightning snakes. It was as if Chun-Ong was pulling their tails, spreading them across the ground in an instant. Amidst the roar of thunder and the pouring rain, lightning wreaked havoc, forming a fan shape hundreds of meters in front of Chun-Ong. The bodies of all the people inside suddenly shook and were thrown high up into the air. They felt a scorching electric current fiercely colliding with their bodies. The power formed by the electric current threw them high up into the air. The heat of the electric current wreaked havoc on their bodies, turning some parts of them into charcoal. However, under Chun-Ang's control, they did not die, but they no longer had the strength to resist. Under a certain degree of precision, high-voltage lightning was actually an effective energy-disabling weapon. But in theory, no one could control such precision, let the lightning hit the human body, and yet maintain an extremely short speed without causing fatal injuries. No one could do it. O'Connor saw countless dancing silver snakes suddenly appear in the thunderclouds in the sky. These lightning bolts spread to the ground, and at this moment, a thunderstorm descended from the sky. His ears were filled with loud noises, and countless huge roars of thunder almost made him lose consciousness. The dazzling light of the lightning made him unable to open his eyes. At this moment, the camp in front of them was like a prison of lightning. Loud noise and dazzling light were the best disabling weapons. In modern times, they were often used to disperse rioting crowds. The former was called disabling bomb, and the latter was called flash bomb. Both of them were used to subdue people without shedding a drop of blood by attacking their fragile senses. It was as if hundreds of disabling bombs and flash grenades were wreaking havoc in the barracks. Chun-Ong had no intention of protecting their fragile sight and hearing. Apart from the unlucky ones who were killed by the lightning, countless people lost their hearing at this moment. Only a very small number of people who had undergone special strengthening and training could see clearly under such circumstances. The vampires were able to do so, and so were some of the priests. The archbishop looked at the terrifying shadow in the dense lightning and lamented, "Oh God, have you come to punish us personally?" He trembled as he raised the cross in his hand and shot out a soul-burning holy light in that direction. At this moment, a silver light pierced through his heart. Under the powerful voltage, the second in command of the Protestant Church of England, the Archbishop of York, died silently. Baron Fermoy roared at the figure in the lightning in despair. Chen Ang's consciousness sensed the rich electric charge in the clouds. Under his guidance, an even more violent wave of lightning fell from the sky, turning the entire camp into hell. O'Connor was outside the camp, watching it turn into a pile of ruins in the lightning. The electromagnetic network on the ionosphere was rich in the ionosphere's free electrons, which were closer to the sun's atmosphere and were the first to come into contact with the sun's energy. Photons carried rich energy and ionized most of the atoms here, causing them to transition in energy levels and release free electrons. These free electrons and ions contained a huge amount of energy. This powerful energy was used by the electromagnetic network laid by Chen Ang to form a thundercloud rich in electric charge above the Suez military base, giving birth to the thunderstorm. But this power, which was so powerful that it could easily destroy most of the power of the Holy Church controlled by Baron Fermoy, was only a small prelude. It was not much different from the high-voltage electric towers set up in the Tunguska region during the Terrace experiment. The rich electric charge only served to provide a coordinate. Chen Ang slowly walked out of the camp. He gradually moved away from the center of the thunderstorm, and the soldiers at the checkpoint and O'Connor gradually saw his appearance. He did not look like he had walked out of the center of the thunderstorm. Instead, he was very calm and composed. The rich electric charge evaporated the water on his body, and even the heavy rain could not extinguish the raging thunder in the center of the camp. When Chen Ang walked towards the checkpoint, the soldiers on guard did not dare to stop him. They were like a group of frightened rabbits, huddled together, and watched as Chen Ang walked out of the checkpoint they were guarding. O'Connell saw the face that appeared in every one of his nightmares. Under O'Connell's horrified gaze, Chen Ang turned back slightly and used his finger to guide the thunderstorm. With a huge bolt of lightning in the air, he drew the symbol of the Eye of Horus. Devil, devil. Some soldiers could not bear the huge psychological pressure and were ready to open fire. Another bolt of lightning shot out from the thunderstorm and nailed him to the ground. Jacob didn't know if it was an illusion or something else, but he seemed to see the tip of the lightning forming a strange spear. But in reality, he couldn't see the lightning at all. At that speed, all he could see was a blinding flash of lightning. The explosion caused by the lightning threw the comrade next to the soldier high into the air. When Chen Ang walked past O'Connor, he reminded him, "You'd better leave this area as soon as possible. The prelude is about to end. The electric charge here is enough to form a target. The real attack is about to come. I think you should run at least 5,000 meters away to be relatively safe." O'Connor said with a trembling voice, "But your enemies are no longer here. They have been sent to hell by you. What else do you want?" The main purpose is to do an experiment, to see the strength and launch time of the space-based weather attack weapon, and, at the same time, to get some improved data. Chen Ang looked back and said calmly, "As for them, it's just along the way. For the enemy we have to deal with next, some lightning can't hit them." Chen Ang seemed to be calm, but his speed was not slow. When O'Connor woke up the soldiers who had almost lost their minds in the checkpoint and drove the truck a few kilometers away, Chen Ang's cargo ship on the Suez Canal slowly passed them. Then, a strong light illuminated the entire sky. At 7:17 a.m. on June 30th, 1908, near the Tunguska River in the Evenki Autonomous Region of Siberia, Russia, 800 kilometers northwest of Lake Baikal, latitude 60. 55 degrees north, longitude 101. 57 degrees east, a strong light illuminated the vast land from Siberia to Western Europe. Then, it triggered a big explosion equivalent to the combined energy of 1,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs. The fire caused by the explosion burned down the virgin forest within hundreds of miles around, and herds of reindeer were burned to ashes in the fire. O'Connell could only see a vast expanse of whiteness in front of him. Then, the shockwave lifted the military vehicle he was in high up into the air. Due to the protection of the protagonist's halo, he was lucky enough to land in the Suez Canal. The core area of the thunderstorm was completely obliterated by the direct attack of the space-based weapons. At this moment, the powerful electric current even distorted the space at the core. Chapter 678. The airship slowly landed in the ruins. Although Chun-Ong had accidentally killed a lot of vampires of Horus's eye during the experiment, the explosion only happened in the core camp, and there were few casualties in other areas that were blocked. The explosion destroyed the order maintained by the British special agents, and the vampires of Horus's eye, who had been suppressed by them, regained control of the situation. With the chaos after the explosion, they regained control of the military base. Now, they were expanding rapidly with the help of the people that Chun-Ong brought. On the one hand, they purged the entire military base, and, on the other hand, they developed their descendants among the remaining officers. Even if the British sent more people next time, it would be impossible for them to regain control of the Suez region. Chun-Ong left most of the people that he brought with him. The banks of the Suez Canal would become the second largest base of Horus's eye, second only to Cairo. The vampires of Horus's eye would infiltrate various parts of Europe through this transportation route. In the short 2 days that Chun-Ong sorted out the Suez region, they controlled a banker in France, the head of a factory in Ruhr, Germany, and sent a few spies to London, England. With the help of this Eurasian artery, the virus of Horus's eye was continuously injected into Europe and the Far East. They went to England, Germany, France, Belgium, Russia, India, and China. Compared to the steady and crushing forces in Egypt, this time they secretly expanded at a speed that was 100 times faster than before. After dealing with most of the institutional work in the Suez region, Chun-Ong returned to Cairo by airship. Zhao Yingqi's eyes were sunken, and her face was as pale as a vampire's. She had not been strengthened and modified by the vampires. The reason why she looked so haggard was purely because she was tired. Obviously, Chun-Ong was using women as livestock again. The tradition of samsara travelers treating women as livestock and men as robots was cruelly passed on by Chun-Ong. As the most durable true ancestor of vampires, Hong Fan had been put on the top priority list by Chun-Ong, and he had less than an hour of free time every day. Although Zhang Ziqiang did not need to go out to the field to kill people, organizing the relevant documents took up 60% of his time, and he had to review the intelligence in the remaining time. When Horus's eye was expanding rapidly, the swarm of important intelligence could drive anyone crazy. Zhao Yingqi only had a little free time when she was running back. She endured the fatigue and injected herself with an anti-fatigue potion. After a while, when the potion took effect, she barely mustered her strength and said, "Boss, I can't take it anymore. Can I take a leave after this business trip?" Without turning his head, Chun-Ong said, "No, the Horus's Eye organization is currently transforming from a regional organization in Egypt to a global organization. There's a lot of work to be done. As the team member in charge of monitoring the Horus's Eye, you must ensure that we have control during this process and that the organization we create will not go out of control. It is estimated that we will return to the God dimension after we finish the second plot ahead of time." In the third storyline, which is the confrontation between the undead empires of the East and the West, we will not be able to directly control the Eye of Horus for a long time. Therefore, we must strengthen our influence on this organization during this limited period of time. Zhao Yingqi took a deep breath when she heard this. She was deeply afraid that she would relax and become completely useless. She asked curiously, "Actually, you don't have to come in person for this field mission, boss. This kind of small matter shouldn't require you to do it yourself. As long as you give control of the space-based weapons, any team leader of the 9 Pillar Gods can take care of it." "If I don't come, how would Imodin dare to do it?" Chun-Ong shook his head gently and said, "I left the black scripture of the undead in Cairo because I want Imodin to reveal his trump card. But if I am in Cairo, Imodin will suspect that I am secretly controlling his trump card. On the one hand, he has to guard against the Egyptian gods, so he can't act in person, and on the other hand, he is worried that I will interfere. So only when I leave Cairo will he send someone to retrieve the black scripture of the undead and reveal his trump card. Imidin stood in the deepest part of the Abu Simbel temple. Huge stone statues were lined up along the long corridor. This was a temple carved in the rock cave. Every year, only the spring equinox, Ramesses II's birthday, and the autumn equinox, Ramesses II's ascension day, could sunlight pass through the long corridor and shine on where Imidin was standing. The bracelet of Thanatos had already shown the location of the Amzi oasis, but Imidin was still waiting for someone. Shun Tu Gong slowly walked into the temple with the morning light behind him. Behind him were four mysterious people. The first person on the left was a woman with a veil. She wore a robe similar to that of an Arab, and her face was hidden behind a veil. Unlike the Arab veil, her eyes were also hidden behind the veil, and they seemed to be completely closed. The second person on the left was a cloud of fog. Although he had the shape of a person, he looked completely made of a cloud of constantly squirming black fog. The first person on the right was not a person at all. It was a distorted shadow. It was formed from light, shadow, and distorted space. It was like an indescribable glass-like object. It was the most dangerous and creepiest person among the four. The last person was a woman, but humans could not look at her face directly, so no one knew what she looked like. When the four arrived at the Abu Simbel temple, there were strange changes in the temple. The broken stone statues around them suddenly recovered, but sometimes the statues would twist into a strange form. The original long corridor suddenly extended a long distance, making Imidin feel like he was at the end of the long corridor on a dot far, far away. When Shun Tu Gong led them to Imidin, he felt like he had stepped into a labyrinth of time and space. Sometimes, people dressed like ancient Egyptian priests appear beside him, and he listened to them talking in ancient Egyptian. Sometimes, a group of modern Western tourists walked up to him, carrying backpacks and taking pictures with their smartphones. Sometimes, he saw Egyptians dressed like Arabs who were talking loudly in Arabic. Chapter 679. When he was young, when he was old, it was as if he had compressed his entire life's four-dimensional state into a three-dimensional world of himself. Shinta Gong walked forward, but with every step he took, there would be another him behind him. Sometimes it would be his appearance when he was young, and sometimes he would emit a powerful and awe-inspiring aura. As a warrior who had cultivated the Book of the Chaos to the Earth Kunlun realm, Shinta Gong even saw a certain him using Purple Star River to tear apart space, and powerful auras collided in the temple. An endless surge of true martial intent rushed towards him, and the angry roar of a hymn sounded in his ears. Gong, he does not care about the past. Even if you are my past, die for me. The mysterious existence formed from light and shadow suddenly spread out in all directions. All the light and shadow, including the hymn that Shinta Gong left behind, were distorted into a chaotic state. The Purple Star River that was rushing towards him was also distorted into an indescribable state. There was no space, no time, no existence. Of course, there was no absolute killing intent and lethality to slash at himself. Even though Shinta Gong's will was incomparably strong, he could not help but feel his blood run cold. As he walked forward, he left behind a human-shaped phantom that was the size of his 6-year-old self. It was filled with indescribable distortions. The woman whose face could not be seen, for some unknown reason, suddenly extended her hand towards a shadow he left behind. Some sort of existence on her body seemed to dispel the distortions, revealing the 6-year-old Shinta Gong, who was wearing children's clothing, standing there in a daze. When Shinta Gong saw the woman extend her hand towards him, a ruthless look flashed in his eyes. A saber light flashed, chopping at the woman's outstretched hands. At this moment, another veiled woman suddenly opened her eyes. Her eyes seemed to lead to a bottomless abyss. At this moment, Shinta Gong felt that he had chopped at a distorted point in space. With that point as the center, everything around him suddenly disappeared. His saber was cut in the middle, and the blade that had reached into the spherical space had already disappeared without a trace. The woman, who could not look directly at her face, placed her hand on little Shinagong's face. Shinagong only felt a creepy feeling crawl up his heart. That suffocating feeling of danger made him completely unable to suppress his killing intent. Imodin sternly shouted, "Enough! See, make it Kasaikamwe, come here." Only then did the woman, whose face was shrouded in a layer of fog, stop what she was doing. She slowly retracted her hand, and at the instant she left little Shun Tu's hand, as if she was careless, she used her sharp nails to leave a tiny wound under little Shun Tu's eye. Shinagong was completely enraged. All the Kunlun chi in his body surged out from his hands. Imodin shouted, "Stop!" Shinto Palace. A powerful spiritual deterrence suppressed Shintagong's violent chi, and Imodin sincerely said, "I apologize for Sir Mate's foolish behavior." As he spoke, Imodin glanced coldly at the invisible woman. His eyes were like an abyss of chaos, causing her body to tremble slightly. "Kasakemwe, retract your presence. All of you come here," Imodin said coldly to the four of them. At this moment, the space-time disorder slowly disappeared. Shintagong and the others appeared directly in front of Imodin. Shintagang realized that the state of his body had changed. As a warrior, his keen sense of smell allowed him to realize that he did not seem to have teleported in front of Imodin, but had appeared in the future where he had appeared in front of Imodin. His posture, strength exertion, physical state, and even the speed of his blood flow had all changed. It was as if a period of time had been skipped in between. Shintagong extended his right hand and touched his left eye. An old scar that had not been there before had appeared. It was exactly the same shape as the one that Sir Mate had scratched. The scar had already scabbed over. Through his high understanding of his body, Shinagong realized that it was an old scar. Even though it had not appeared before he entered the temple, after it appeared, it had already been caused a long time ago. Furthermore, based on the current state of the wound, it should have been left behind when he was 6 years old. Shintagong's face was calm, but his heart was filled with killing intent. Imodin looked at the 5 people who had come in front of him. He turned his head and said to Shintagong, "You have completed your mission well. I will compensate you for today's offense. You may leave first. I will personally give you the reward and compensation for the mission later." Shintagong bowed slightly and calmly retreated without looking at the 4 people. After Shintagong walked out of the temple, Imodin looked at the 4 people who did not look like humans and sighed. 2,500 years have passed, but you are still willing to serve me. I'm very happy. His eyes silently swept across the 4 people as he read out their names one by one. Kasaikamwe, Sekimib, Sir Mate, Meanies, my adopted sons and daughters. I was once the high priest of Egypt, so I turned a blind eye to the hatred in your hearts. I know that your hearts are burning with the flames of revenge. You desire to drink the blood of your father God and take revenge for everything they have done to you. Now, my heart is burning with the same flames as yours. The purpose of our survival is for revenge. Now, I will release you. I will control you. I will help you take revenge. I will destroy and slaughter and take revenge on the gods. The gods of Egypt will usher in destruction and dusk. We will step on their corpses and usher in a new world. Sekimib, who was one of the 4 people below, slowly said, "We are the children of God, but they see us as monsters. When we were born, when we were extremely weak, you extended a helping hand to us and took us in. My brothers and sisters died in the mouths of the gods. They ate our bodies and divinity and banished our souls to the underworld. You have saved us. We have been imprisoned for 2,500 years and have been deprived of all glory. Today, we are willing to take revenge on the gods with you and let them have a taste of the suffering we have suffered." Sekimib stepped forward and lifted Imodin's hand. He placed it on his body and let the black fog envelop Imodin's hand. He opened up the anger, hatred, and fear that had been accumulating in his heart for a long time to Imodin. "Take us, the unfilial children, and take revenge on the gods. Father, Imodin looked at the death bracelet on his wrist and said indifferently, "They will never know how big of a mistake they have made. You have to hide your names, because your names hide your secrets and weaknesses. I will help you cover up your past. Remember, the gods are not powerful. They are like towering trees. All their power is used to fight against their own existence. They are big and useless. One small mistake is enough to erase them. Rather than saying that they killed the gods, it is better to say that they overpowered themselves. This world no longer needs the existence of the gods." Chapter 680. The next morning, the airship appeared above the Nile River and gazed at the great pyramids of Giza in the distance, bathed in sunlight. Chun-Ong stood at the bow of the airship. He could already feel the changes and huge variables in this world. In the system operated by the Lord God, there was a huge error in the gear of this mummy world, although this error was not to the extent of tearing a hole in the Lord God's multidimensional system. This kind of variable could even cause the violent surge of the world's origin tide, which was exactly what the Lord God wanted to achieve. However, just like how supplements would become poison when the amount reached a certain level, this kind of surging origin tide and world variable would also cause a huge tear in the Lord God system if it reached a certain level. And Chun-Ong had already planted the seed. The huge surge and change of the world caused by the tearing of the world would give the Republic a new foundation. This would allow the Republic to obtain a new foundation. At that time, the virus known as civilization would cause exponential growth. No one could underestimate the immense potential of civilization, not to mention the fact that this civilization was a heaven's apocalypse. Chun-Ong had specially cultivated a civilization with extremely high variables and uncontrollable characteristics. In Chun-Ang's eyes, countless data and information rolled into a torrent. According to information cosmology, if the demon Laplace knows all the information and relevant variables in the universe, he will show the entire process of a universe, past and future. Omniscience means omnipotence. At that time, the entire universe will be reduced in dimension relative to him, because all variables can be calculated and all changes can be predicted. At my level, quantum changes are known, and the algorithms of human consciousness are also known. He has already recognized the souls of the entire universe and reached the level of information unification. He can modify and control the universe, and he can pursue more unknowns. However, the reason why he can reach this level is because of the uncontrollable nature of the souls of living beings, or rather, intelligent beings, which are variables. This kind of variable that exceeds cognition is the miracle of relative cognition. He can only complete the evolution of cognitive structure and information construction by expanding his variables to infinity. However, the variables of an individual life are limited. Just like humans, their behavior patterns, memories, emotions, and everything else have rules and can be recognized. This regularity and cognition is the reason why variables are constrained and miracles are created. It's impossible for humans to know the entire universe because humans are existences that contain a set of 3 views and information structures. Just like any orderly machine, they have limitations. To surpass these limitations, one has to make oneself infinite. Don't restrict yourself. Understand and transform yourself. Constantly change yourself and obtain progress and potential. Just like an autonomous robot that can infinitely recognize and modify itself. If a robot can use external resources to upgrade itself and input external information to create variables, then given enough time, it will continue to evolve endlessly. This is what it means to be limitless. In this process, all achievements can be abandoned, all common sense can be falsified, and it will be infinitely closer to the truth. That's how I am. I've killed my past self countless times, abandoned the variables that have been concluded from the rules, abandoned countless past selves, and approached the infinite. Apart from a Tao heart that is based on science, cognition, no ability, and research to change the world. Everything can be abandoned in the next change, including human nature and the cognitive structure of being human. Infinity without constraints will eventually lose its variables and become an objective law, losing the most precious thing in the soul of intelligent creatures, infinite possibilities. Chenong sighed and said to Zhao Yingqi beside him, "Send a signal to gather the reincarnators." Imodin should have already discovered the location of the Amsi Oasis. The last battle before we leave this world is coming. As the airship slowly descended, Zhang Ziqiang, Hong Fan, and the other reincarnators of the Nine Provinces team, as well as the captains of the other reincarnation teams, appeared on the landing platform of the airship. The captain of the Dream Demon team, Edward, heard Chenong say, "I won't go down. You guys come up. We'll set off for the Amsi Oasis now." Edward asked doubtfully, "Do you know where the Amsi Oasis is? We've searched all the relevant clues for the past 2 days, but we haven't found any traces of it. Even Imodin has to use the death bracelet to search for it." "How do you know?" "Imodin isn't looking for the location of the Amsi Oasis because he already knows where it is. He's going to complete the necessary ritual to open the death bracelet and go to the 4 temples to obtain a lot of information about the death god." Chenong replied, "The Amsi Oasis isn't hard to find, but it's not in this world, and it's not the oasis you think it is. Most of the time, it exists in an imaginary space and doesn't exist in the real world. The death god's hand is its coordinates, and only the death bracelet can make it devote itself to the world. I suspect that the entire Amsi Oasis is in the death god's dream, or it might even be the yang side of his divine realm. The land covered by the Amsi Oasis isn't the human world." Edward was horrified. "Are you saying that the place we're going to might be the divine realm of a god?" Chenong shook his head. "It's not a divine realm. It's at most a form of the physical world. It has 2 states that can be changed at any time. One is the real space state, and the other is the imaginary space state. In the imaginary space, this world has no length, width, or height. It doesn't even exist in the form of a physical object, so it's a strange state. That's why Anubis can expand and collapse such a huge space at any time in this non-divine era when divine power is declining. This is an application of the observation and law of the real world. It's an existence built according to the laws of science. Of course, if you study it with magic or magic, you can also find some laws. According to the system of magic, it's an inherent boundary. Only there can Anubis escape the restraints of the rules of the real world, and it can manifest part of the true God and exert its greatest power." Edward was shocked. In other words, the Amsi Oasis is Anubis's territory, and Kay can use his power to a certain extent. It's like a divine realm on Earth? Chenong looked at him as if he were looking at an idiot. "That means that after all I've said, you still think of it as a divine realm?" "Fine. If you want, you can think of it that way," said Chenong helplessly. Chapter 681. I'm not the one who wants to kill Kay. It's Imodin. We're just there to witness it. Chenong smiled. If Edward had not heard Chun Ang's explanation of the nature of the Amsi Oasis, he might still have had the courage to take the risk. However, now that he knew that they were going to 10-star monster that could, in theory, easily crush all the reincarnators here, it was a place where he could display most of his strength. Moreover, there was a 100% chance that a huge battle would break out. Nonsense, Imodin was going to kill them. So how could they get along peacefully? Now, Imodin was heading to the Ames Oasis in the name of completing the death god's trial. But Chenong knew that he wanted to kill a god. The reincarnators had also guessed that someone wanted to kill a god. Shintu Gong's Yama team even knew most of Imodin's plans. Perhaps even Anubis knew that Imodin wanted to kill him. In this game, Chenong had forced and supported Imodin, while Shintu Gong had supported Imodin most of the time. Imodin also had the help of the 4 abominations. He also had the help of a large group of reincarnators under Chun Ang's control. As for Anubis, apart from Kay himself, he might also be able to get the support of some gods. A fierce battle was bound to unfold between the 2 sides. This time, no matter which side the Samsara travelers belonged to, whether they had ulterior motives or not, they were at least on the same side, coveting the rewards of killing a god. Therefore, Edward calculated for a while and felt that the risk was still under control, so he still boarded the airship. With him as an example, the other samsara team leaders calculated for a while. The special living environment of samsara travelers made them not want to give up any possible huge gains. They were trained by the Lord God to instinctively want to cause trouble. Moreover, even though Chunong pointed out the danger of the AMZ oasis, they still felt that the danger in the oasis hadn't reached the critical point after reading the original work. In other words, the risk was still under control. That was why they boarded the airship that was heading towards the AMZ oasis. David could not help but ask, according to what you said before, the necklace of death is not only a map to the AMZ oasis, but also a key to open the AMZ oasis. We have never studied the key. How can you locate the existence of that space? Have you ever heard of star feng shui? Chenong asked, pointing at the vast blue sky above his head. Are you talking about locating through astrology? David frowned. I've heard of it, but I don't know much about it. Then don't you understand the sensing of dragon veins in alchemy, the study of geomagnetic fields in cultivation, the sensing of planetary magnetic fields in geology, the interaction principle of energy field information in information science, the mechanism of geomagnetic fields in magic research, the theory of the vacuum ocean in the plane tide of magic, the study of the plane structure in arcana research, the inherent nature of barriers in magic theory, and the perception of the warrior. David looked embarrassed. He answered, I don't understand any of that. Chenong finally nodded. That's right. If you don't understand any of that, how can you understand if I tell you? There was no disdain in Chenong's eyes. There was only seriousness and honesty, but he made David feel the most embarrassed. David's face suddenly turned red, then green, and finally purple. Edward shook his head sympathetically and sighed. Even I don't dare to humiliate myself. Who gave this idiot the confidence to question me? In the end, Chun Ong sighed. Out of pity for the mentally retarded, he explained in the simplest terms, it's not difficult to determine the location of the AMZ oasis in the real world. After reading a large number of ancient Egyptian texts, we located the burial place of the great Scorpion Emperor. It's located in a desert in modern northern Sudan. This is still within the scope of archaeology. When we get there, we should be able to follow Imidin and the others. Of course, considering that AMZ oasis is controlled by the god of death, I also located the approximate coordinates of AMZ oasis based on the stars that are connected to the power of the god of death. We can quickly locate the imaginary coordinates of AMZ oasis based on the characteristics of the god of death's power, the inherent boundaries, and the corresponding spatial structure. At the same time, I also tampered with the black scripture of the dead in Imidin's hands, so it can open the door to AMZ oasis for us from the inside. The spacious airship was also because Chun Ong did not want to intervene in the deicital dispute this time, so he did not bring too many subordinates. According to the results of Chun Ang's observation of the stars last night, Imhotep and the others had already left, but the convenience of the airship would allow them to catch up with them very quickly. They would probably arrive soon after Imhotep entered the Emzik oasis. This time, the main force was Imidin. The reincarnators were mostly there to farm points. They could deal with the monsters summoned by Anubis, but it was impossible for them to directly block Anubis. If Imidin could block them, the reincarnators would not hesitate to take advantage of Anubis while Imidin was blocking them. After all, Shun Tu Gong had used the black scripture of the dead to save people. Although Chunong did not know too much information, he could vaguely sense how many people had struggled out of the underworld through the black scripture of the dead. There were a total of 5 abominations. Not only did they know more about Imidin's hidden backup than Shun Tu Gong, they could also roughly sense the nature of their power. Gods were existences that were difficult to describe in terms of power. The energy they released might not necessarily be very strong, but there were many things they could do that were extraordinary. K was a kind of law, a symbol of the world's rules. They were not weapons that focused on killing power. The parts that they revealed were only the parts of the icebergs that were above the sea's surface. Beneath the sea's surface, their essence was even larger. Sometimes, when you shattered the icebergs above the sea's surface, you would think that you had killed a god. However, as time passed, the parts that were below the sea's surface would still float up, and the god would resurrect. The life and death of mortals could not be summed up in the state of gods. Sometimes mortals thought that gods were dead, but to the gods themselves, it might just be a dormant state. Therefore, it was meaningless for mortals to kill gods. They could destroy the parts that they knew, but the true essence of gods, the parts that they could not understand, would still exist. Existences that could truly kill gods were existences like Imidin, who had already set foot in this field. As one of the greatest high priests in ancient Egypt, he knew too many secrets about gods. The rest were even more dangerous existences like Chenong. They understood gods, and the secrets and existences of gods were clear to them. Just as Imidin had said, the existence of gods was huge and bloated. Their consciousness was too small and fragile compared to their essence. If someone understood divinity, the great power of nature, and the related boundaries of the laws, it was very easy to pry open the enormous power of the existence of gods, causing the K to be destroyed by their own power. Just like destroying a towering tree or a skyscraper. As long as the calculations were clear and the information was comprehensive, one only needed to use a relatively small amount of power to destroy the structure of the K, and the K would be crushed by their own enormous existence. Chapter 682. After Edward and the others boarded the airship, they found that the airship seemed to have been modified differently. There were many metal structures on its outer shell, which were connected to each other in a complex and symmetrical geometric pattern. It was a complicated layout that made people dizzy, but it was relatively isolated from the inside. It looked like a useless metal sweater. There was a compass and sextant on the airship for positioning. Otherwise, it would be extremely easy to get lost in a place like North Africa, which was full of yellow sand and had no obvious features. Looking down from the airship, the scenery seemed to have never changed. Except for the green belt along the Nile River, the rest of the land was dry, yellow, and barren. Zhang Ziqiang saw Chun Ong staring at the horizon in the distance and could not help but panic. He quickly asked, "What's wrong? Did something happen to Imidin?" Chun Ong shook his head. "Imidin is fine. After all, no matter what Anubis is planning, he will first let Imidin enter the Amzi Oasis. We are the ones who will be in trouble. If Anubis wants to stop us from entering the Amzi Oasis, he will definitely make a move on the way." After saying that, Chenong smiled slightly. "I just did not expect him to make a move now. I thought it would be a little later." Shaking his head, Chenong ordered, "The sandstorm is coming. Get ready." Edward and the others also heard Chun Ang's order. They were a little nervous, but generally remained calm. After all, for reincarnators, encountering a sandstorm at an altitude of more than 1,000 meters was not a very troublesome thing. David was slightly puzzled. "You knew we would encounter a sandstorm?" he asked. Chenong nodded. "Of course. What is more suitable to stop us in the desert than a sandstorm? Even if the sandstorm can't hurt us, it can at least make us lose our direction. This sandstorm has the divine power of Anubis, which can interfere with the magnetic field. The yellow sand will cover the sky, and even the sextant's navigation will be useless. From his point of view, Anubis is not stupid. He knows what the biggest enemy of desert travelers is, and he has also seen through our weaknesses. He has made full use of the environment we are in. Even reincarnators will be trapped in a harsh environment like the sandstorm when they lose all means of navigation. As long as we are trapped for 3 days, everything in the Amzi Oasis will be settled." David's expression froze slightly. He said with difficulty, "Then why did you choose to travel by the most affected airship? I remember you control the airbase in Cairo. Using a biplane is less affected by the environment than an airship, and it is faster." At this time, the sky was already dusky yellow. Looking down from the airship, countless strands of yellow sand were swept up by the strong wind, rising from the ground. Wisps of dusky yellow were pulled away from the withered earth, gradually turning into a dark yellow. On the opposite side of the airship, a curtain of yellow sand swept over. Xiao Bolong shouted, "The sandstorm is coming. All units, get ready." At this time, Chenong was still answering David. He said calmly, "Indeed, compared to airships, airplanes have an absolute advantage in terms of environmental resistance and speed. Airships have nothing but comfort. And I can also tell you that according to the airship's normal speed, we will enter the Amesy Oasis half a day later than Imogen. So I didn't intend to let this airship travel normally from the beginning, Chunong said with a smile. He asked in return, do you know why I knew that Anubis would cause a sandstorm, but I still chose the airship with the most impact? After saying that, Chunong did not seem to expect their answer. He looked at the sandstorm in the distance and said contemptuously, because we want to prove to Anubis that we are stronger than him. We have to move forward with an indomitable momentum and crush all his means. Only in this way can we be more deeply involved in this situation. At this time, the airship was affected by the strong wind and could no longer maintain a normal route. The clouds in the sky with the airship as the center formed a large vortex that covered dozens of miles. Chunong looked at the huge vortex with a calm and indifferent expression. Edward keenly observed the abnormality of the weather. Edward keenly observed the abnormality of the weather. The huge whirlpool in the sky should not have appeared in the midst of sandstorm. Naturally, it would affect the entire system. Its various systems were interconnected, and there would not be any unnecessary signs, nor would there be any contradictory phenomena. Even Anubis could not, or rather, had no need to go against nature and create a tropical cyclone in the sky when the sandstorm was rampaging in the sea of sand below. This should be your preparation. Edward looked at Chunong in surprise. Anubis is an Egyptian god. Even if his priesthood does not involve the weather, it is not difficult for him to cause a sandstorm with his own characteristics. But how did you go against nature to create a hurricane under the suppression of Anubis' divine power? How did I do it? Chunong explained. Wind and thunder are a pair of opposite trigrams in the 8 diagrams. In the martial arts side, there is often a saying that wind and thunder stimulate each other. In scientific research, storms drive the generation of thunder and lightning. This is easy to understand because the movement of the atmosphere causes the friction between the clouds to increase and the number of charged particles to increase. It should be said that most thunder and lightning are generated by wind, but the formation of wind is due to the uneven heating of the atmosphere on a macroscopic level. Therefore, when wind and thunder stimulate each other, wind generates thunder, but thunder can't stimulate wind. Unless a trace of shock flashed in David's eyes. He felt that he seemed to have touched a very deep, hidden trump card of Team 9 states. He hurriedly asked, unless what? Unless the atmosphere is magnetized. A member of Team 9 states that David had never seen before continued Chunong's words. He was Long. Magnetizing a large area of the atmosphere will cause the charged particles to spread in a certain range. The amount of charge in the atmosphere will rise sharply, and when the electromagnetic field changes violently, it will also cause the atmosphere to move. Edward was the first to deny this statement. Impossible. Not to mention the amount of calculation required for this theory. The energy required is also an astronomical figure. To cause the atmosphere to be charged, the energy consumed is already very terrifying. And to create a huge storm, the scope and space must reach a certain extent, at least covering dozens of square kilometers. Even if we take out a month's worth of electricity in the world, it won't be enough. Neither Long nor Chunong answered, but the strong wind in the sky had gradually formed, presenting an unprecedented spectacle in front of Edward and the others. The movement of the atmosphere at the bottom and the movement of the atmosphere at the middle and upper levels completely contradicted each other, even diverging from each other. The movement of the air at the high altitude and the strong wind brazenly pressed down, and the collision between the two created an unprecedented turbulence. Chapter 683. The electromagnetic network, controlled by Chunong in the ionosphere, transformed the endless charged particles in the ionosphere into electromagnetic waves, magnetizing the atmosphere dozens of kilometers around Chunong due to the imbalance of the electromagnetic field. The atmosphere experienced a violent discharge movement and activity. However, when this trend and elasticity accumulated to the maximum, an unprecedented storm occurred. Chun-Ong and Anubis respectively controlled the movement of the upper and middle layers of the atmosphere. Sandstorms and thunderstorms intertwined. Strong winds guarded the airship, and lightning flashed. The entire airship was like a giant wool bathed in lightning. Countless silver snakes intertwined as it broke through the clouds and moved forward. The upper and middle layers of the atmosphere pushed it forward. The people in the airship looked at the leaping lightning beside them in horror. They felt that the strong wind had completely enveloped the airship. The sandstorm set off by Anubis was ruthlessly pressed against the ground by the strong wind. The waves of sand on the ground seemed to be in a frenzy. However, the airship in the air had already ridden the wind and waves. Surrounded by countless lightning snakes, it was pushed by the strong wind behind it and flew in the direction that Chun-Ong had set. The airship, which had always been slow at this moment, was like a battleship galloping in a storm. However, when the true appearance of the airship was occasionally revealed from the clouds, the locals who were trapped in the sandstorm below watched in horror and shock as the giant ship bathed in lightning tore through the sky. The blazing lightning could not be looked at directly. When the airship passed by a small town, the shock reached its peak. Countless people knelt in the direction of the airship and chanted a mess of the name of the gods. Until decades later, the myth and legend of the gods patrolling the earth on a giant thunderbolt ship was still spread in this place. After galloping like this for dozens of minutes, the divine power of Anubis was completely humiliated by Chun-Ong. Everyone then saw the image of a roaring jackal head formed by the rolling sandstorm below. It showed an extremely angry expression to Chun-Ong. The sandstorm on the ground gathered its last strength and rose into the sky. The huge sandstorm formed the statue of Anubis and rushed towards the airship. Chun-Ong just grasped something in the air, and countless lightning wrapped around the airship gathered into a strange spear. It was the image of the Spear of Judgment that Chun-Ong was playing with. The spear formed by lightning was longer than the length of the airship, and the blazing lightning could not be looked at directly. Chun-Ong waved his right hand forcefully, and the Spear of Judgment that was formed by lightning suddenly shot out and stabbed straight at Anubis's chest. The lightning tore the sandstorm apart. Everything looked like two giant gods fighting in the sky, like the reappearance of an ancient myth. Edward and the others could not see the whole picture of this battle. They could not even see the entire body of Anubis's sandstorm, nor could they see the Spear of Judgment. They could only see the violent storm accompanied by lightning tearing the sandstorm apart and tearing a huge gap in front of the airship. In a place where they could not see, the airship passed through the huge wound caused by the Spear of Judgment on Anubis's chest. The jackal head let out a divine roar of anger, but its body had begun to collapse. It could only look back at the airship with extreme reluctance. After this final struggle, the sandstorm on the surface had subsided. Edward and the others did not dare to breathe too loudly. They carefully looked at Chun-Ong, who had been looking down on the gods with indifference. His expression was as calm as if he had crushed an ant. They could not figure out who was on the side of the gods. After the sandstorm passed, the lightning around the airship also subsided. Although it was still bathed in lightning, the storm that propelled the airship and the lightning that protected it had decreased to a relatively stable level. Naturally, the airship was still moving in extremely high speed towards the Amesy oasis. Chun-Ong closed his eyes slightly, as if he was resting. After an hour, Chun-Ong, who was resting with his eyes closed, suddenly stood up. His eyes were like lightning as he looked in front of the airship. Edward and the others were shocked. Just as they were about to stand up and be alert, a pilot reported, "Sir, something is interfering with the airship's navigation." Chun-Ong said calmly, "Report. Because of the thunderstorm, the compass has lost its direction. Because of the same reason, we can't see the sun, and the sextant can't be used. We can only use the satellite laser that you left behind for navigation. But just now, a mysterious force destroyed our satellite. Anubis has not given up yet." Chun-Ong sneered. "He is afraid. If the previous sandstorm was only to eliminate the interference and was afraid of me, then after being directly defeated by me, he has begun to fear. He has already understood that we have the ability to add a heavy weight to Immoden's victory, or even to defeat him directly. He has finally begun to fear. Chanong laughed in a low voice. If there are no more interference factors, then Anubis will definitely seek his allies among the gods. We have finally dragged more gods into this mess. Give them hope and give them pressure. Only then will there be more of them involved in this torrent. In the end, all the thrones of the gods will fall, and no god will survive. Edward muttered. So what do we do now? Anubis has already discovered the secret of our navigation. We have only launched and controlled 3 microsatellites, and we can't afford to lose them. Chanong just took out a simple compass, and it was even a square Bagua compass. It looked like the ancient compass held by traditional Chinese fortune tellers, simple and crude with mysterious words engraved on it. He handed the compass to the navigator and said, "Look at this to navigate." Edward looked at the compass that looked like it had been carved not long ago. Edward saw the young navigator holding the compass and adjusting the direction. He hesitated and said, "Is this a magic item like Jack's navigation pointer?" Chen-Ong shook his head. "This is just an ordinary compass." Edward looked hesitant, but Chen-Ong explained, "Don't worry. Our navigator specializes in the feng shui of the celestial sect, mountain sect, crepe myrtle sect, triad sect, and octagon sect. He is best at capturing aura. He is now looking for the obscure aura in the dragon vein. With the divine power of Anubis as a reference, it will not be difficult to find the vein. It's a pity that we can't look at the stars now. Otherwise, in this boundless, sandy terrain, it would be best to use the celestial feng shui to find the Amisai oasis. But if we can see the sky, it would be better to use the sextant." Edward did not know what expression to use to respond to him. With the help of the storm, the airship's journey was smooth. They came to the sky above a desert. The navigator reported, "Sir, the aura of the Amisai oasis is entrenched in this desert, but my knowledge of feng shui is not enough to lock onto the entrance." Chapter 684. David closed his eyes and sensed carefully before shaking his head. "No, I can't sense any abnormal aura at all, but this should be the location of the Yangtze oasis. I can separate a trace of the aura of Yin Mo teams Shun Tu Gong, and there are a few strange auras around him. We still need Professor Chun to find the entrance." Chun-Ong looked at the desert, and a hint of understanding flashed in his eyes. He smiled and said, "I was prepared to sense the backup plan I set up in the Black Sutra of the Undead. I was prepared to lose a chess piece lying in ambush beside Immoden, but it seems that there is no need for that now." Edward reminded, "But if you send the Black Sutra of the Undead back to Immoden, he will not be without suspicion." "I know." Chanong nodded and said, "So I set up 2 backup plans. The first one was to make him let down his guard, but now it seems that this backup plan, which is bound to be exposed, can be used in a more important place. David, the strange aura you sensed is an extremely distorted negative emotion that can amplify the hatred, fear, and malice in your heart." David's eyes flashed with a trace of horror when he heard this. He closed his eyes and adjusted his breathing for a long time before saying, "There is indeed such a characteristic. I didn't pay attention at first and almost fell for it. This aura is formed by extremely distorted emotions. With a little sensing, I can sense the madness and malice in it, which makes people upset and restless. I thought it was a natural reaction due to the aura, but I didn't expect that someone had done something to it and triggered the demons in my heart. That aura is like a black fog, but it can't be detected by the naked eye. It can only be detected by spiritual power. Everyone be careful." Chen-Ong stretched out his hand and pulled out a wisp of strange black fog from the void. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly, and he said, "The aura of the black fog should have been deliberately left behind by Immoden and the others, but there are still 3 wisps of very weak auras. That is very interesting." Chen-Ong tapped lightly and sealed the black fog in a bit of magic power. He gave it to the others to get used to in advance so that they could get some information from it. This was so that they wouldn't be caught off guard when they faced it. After sensing it for a while, Edward said in a deep voice, The black fog should be something similar to a mind infection, or rather, a part of mind infection's characteristics. It can absorb a person's negative emotions to strengthen itself. At the same time, it's the mind of an aberrant. It's similar to the Lord of the Rings aura I sensed in the Lord of the Rings world, but it's not as terrifying. David's expression was very ugly. He knew that his mental resistance was the weakest among the group. If David was careless and fell into the trap, he would have died a long time ago. He could not fight against this enemy. Luo Sheng took the black mist and examined it with his eyes closed. It's similar to the heavenly demonic qi, but as long as one's absolute martial meaning is sharp enough, one can use it to kill it. But the mental infection should only be part of its effect. Chun Ong said to the people beside him, "Bring down the experimental subjects from the airship." Very soon, a Blood Clan member in black dragged down a fierce-looking man with a tyrannical and cowardly expression. Edward and the others knew what Chun Ong was going to do. They silently retreated a few meters, and Edward even got Elizabeth to set up a simple barrier. Inside the spell formation, the man stared blankly at the people surrounding him and retreating, but his eyes were fixed on Chun Ong, pretending to be harmless. Everyone present was more cunning than he was, so how could they not see the hatred buried deep in his eyes? Chun Ong did not even spare him a glance. With a flick of his finger, the black mist attached to the man's body. Only then did everyone become interested in observing him. The hatred in the man's eyes was quickly exposed, and soon he could no longer hide the violence and hatred in his eyes. He stared at Chun Ong fiercely and let out a bloodthirsty roar. The skin and flesh on his back began to melt, and the bone spurs on his spine rapidly pierced through his skin and protruded. A black mist of rotting flesh and blood surrounded him, and in the mist, the man rapidly changed into something that no longer looked human. His joints were thick and twisted, and the black mist on his body was highly corrosive. Even with the restriction of the spell formation, everyone could feel an astonishing malice pouncing toward them. Luo Sheng's eyes flashed with a hint of sword light, and he killed the malice that was pouncing toward him. The malice of the black mist bypassed Chun Ong directly, as if there was something in his position that even this extremely twisted malice was afraid of. But the others were not in a good situation. Relying on his previous experience, David quickly sealed his mind and resisted with his will. A hint of holy light appeared on Edward's body, resisting the corrosion of the black mist, but David's eyes were already red, and he was about to lose control. At this moment, Chun Ong flicked his finger casually, and a sharp edge will cut down everything. Only then did David feel relieved, and he regained consciousness. Looking at the twisted skeleton of the dead man, everyone was already a little shocked and scared. Edward said in a low voice, "This black mist can not only infect the mind, but also corrupt the soul and flesh. The corrupted flesh and blood will turn into black mist, which is corrosive and negative energy. In this process, the black mist's ability to infect and corrupt will increase rapidly, which is extremely dangerous for those with weak will. And the black mist parasite's physical attack power will also increase in this process," David added. "The black fog is like a special parasite. It grows rapidly by corrupting the host's flesh and soul. No, I suspect that it's not just corrupting the flesh and blood. After a long time, even the bones will be melted, leaving only a human-shaped black fog. But before it corrupts the bones, it will modify these skeletons." Luo Sheng drew his long sword and threw away a piece of bone. Looking at the strange color on the bone stubble, he explained, "Its hardness has reached the strength of some special alloys, and with the enhancement of the black mist, it will be very troublesome for any of us to deal with it, and we might even be killed by it." David took a deep breath and said with a trembling voice, "This is just a wisp of his aura." Looking at the pile of bones, Chun Ong smiled coldly and said, "He is not as scary as you think. This strange black mist is already equivalent to a part of his body, or rather, the target itself is made of black mist. Although it is still very dangerous and lethal, it is not as scary as you think. where a wisp of aura can kill all the enemies. He stretched out his finger and pointed at the remaining 3 wisps of aura, saying, "The aura information of the remaining 3 targets is incomplete and cannot carry the complete information of the target like the black mist. I can only detect some of their incomplete characteristics. You guys have to be careful." Chapter 685. The other 2 hid their auras even more deeply. They didn't leave anything valuable behind. They shouldn't be in a state like the black fog and the time aberration that reveal their true nature all the time. 2 clear figures appeared in Chun Ang's mind. He smiled and said, "It's about time for us to move." Chun Ang slowly came to the end where Imodin and the others' auras disappeared. Edward could not help but ask, "If we don't activate the ambush in the necromancy black scripture, how are we going to get in?" As soon as he said that, he saw the navigator on the airship rushing over with the compass that Chun Ang had given him. Looking at the empty void in front of him, Edward did not know what to say. He wanted to yell at Chun Ang. What happened to the virtual space we agreed on? Where's the inherent barrier? Where's the kingdom of God on earth? Anubis put his blood, sweat, and tears into designing this thing, and you're just going to let someone use a broken compass to solve it? However, he was afraid that after he said that, he would be slapped in the face again and be answered with, "You know nothing about feng shui." So his expression changed strangely, but he gave up on the chance to say anything and just watched silently from the side. Just as the navigator walked to Chun Ang's side, he looked at the compass and adjusted its position slightly. Then he shouted behind him, "It should be here." As soon as he said that, there was a slight tremor from the ground. Edward was shocked to see a tentacle bursting out of the ground beside Chun Ang. If not for Chun Ang's calm expression, Edward could not help but draw his sword and be on guard. The thickest part of the tentacle was about the thickness of a person's arms, and it did not look as disgusting as some indescribable thing. Instead, it had a hint of the elegance of biotechnology. The lines of the tentacle were simple and smooth, with only countless mysterious patterns that looked like circuit diagrams running through its body. The light blue patterns had a hint of electricity, giving it the feeling of a high-energy creature from the void. Its main part was a combination of half machine and half creature. While maintaining the flexibility of a living creature, it was also embedded with different mechanical and electronic structures. Edward looked at the tentacle and felt that it was both strange and familiar at the same time. He thought about it for a while and realized that although it had been modified beyond recognition, he could still see the traces of the octopus monsters when the Great Pyramid of Giza fought against the Grim Reaper's army. However, this time, the octopus monsters seemed to have been modified. Only Chun Ang knew that the energy lines were the product of the octopus after it obtained the electromagnetic cells of the Den Den Mushi. In Chun Ang's technological accumulation, there was a large amount of technology that combined biotechnology and electronics. It was not a big deal for the octopus to suddenly jump into the electronic era. 8 tentacles burrowed out of the ground and surrounded the semicircular door formed by Chun Ang. At the end of the tentacles, a metal protrusion suddenly reflected a ray of electricity. The electric charges in the sky quickly gathered, and the electricity between the 8 tentacles increased, forming a magnetic field that enveloped the group. Gradually, a misty space appeared in front of them. Above the yellow sand, a strange oasis floated like a mirage. It was an oasis that should not have appeared. It appeared to be distorted by light and shadow. An oasis that looked like a tropical rainforest should not appear in the middle of a desert. Chun Ang took a step towards the mirage-like scene. His whole body seemed to have squeezed into a distorted illusion, and he suddenly became illusory. Edward and the others did not dare to delay. They squeezed into the oasis as well. Their bodies were weightless for a moment, but soon they stepped on solid ground. A fresh breath came from their mouths, with a refreshing smell of water vapor and the fragrance of plants. It instantly dispelled the boredom of the desert. What appeared in front of them was a circular oasis. The central pyramid that was visible to the naked eye was magnificent and tall. The top of the pyramid seemed to be gathering a brilliant and endless light. Before Chun Ang could stand still, The huge diamond at the top of the pyramid shot out a dazzling golden light, piercing Chun-Ong and the others. The high-temperature positive energy ray, with the destructive power of a high-energy laser and the ability of positive energy to destroy evil, locked onto the group. Chun-Ong just smiled faintly, and then the glass-like time distortion aura wrapped around his hand was suddenly shot out. The glass-like aura that distorted light and shadow and space instantly expanded into a huge barrier in front of them, silently swallowing the ray that shot out from the top of the pyramid. It seems that the owner of this place does not welcome us. Chun-Ong smiled and turned to look at Edward and the others. If you want to move at the same time, follow me. If you want to explore on your own, you can leave here. This swamp rainforest should be hiding a lot of secrets. It should be enough for you to farm points. But be careful, Anubis is... Edward and the others looked at each other, their eyes clearly saying, "How stupid are we to act alone when Anubis is so obviously malicious?" They had made up their minds to hug Chun-Ong, who dared to fight against Anubis. The reincarnators were silent. Their answer was to stick close to Chun-Ong, their eyes like small animals that were worried about being left behind. Chun-Ong waited for the troops behind him to be teleported in. Compared to previous operations, he brought much fewer people this time. There were only a dozen black-clothed vampires armed with modern firearms contributed by the reincarnators to guard the surroundings. 5 tentacles equipped with Gatling guns were fully armed. Even the tentacles in charge of close combat had chainsaws installed on them. They set up a line of defense further away. Because of the anti-aircraft weapons at the top of the central pyramid, the plane that was originally scheduled could not fly. The group had to walk and follow the tracks left by Imodin and the others. This primitive swamp forest contained many dangers. The reincarnators knew that there were poisonous insects in the tropics and those bloodthirsty and violent dwarfs that could shoot arrows from their mouths. Of course, they did not have to worry about the harassment of these dwarfs. If they dared to come over, the Gatling guns and chainsaws of the vampires would teach them how to behave. But the process of advancing was still not smooth. There were no roads in this uninhabited primitive forest. It was very difficult for a relatively large team to move forward quickly. Under their feet were tree roots, shrubs, vines, and even ferns. The group had to open a path and move forward while being careful to guard against unknown dangers. Chapter 686. Not long after, the road in the rainforest became more and more difficult to walk. The terrain changed from flat to steep and beautiful. The evergreen vines were like snakes hanging down from high places. The humidity in the jungle was extremely high, making everyone's body sticky. Breathing was also very difficult. There was sufficient rainfall and sunlight here. The plants and poisonous insects grew very wantonly. David slapped the leeches on his back and couldn't help but complain, "Why is it so difficult for us? It's fine if there are no roads here, but the poisonous mosquitoes and leeches are driving people crazy." In the original plot, how could O'Connor and Evelyn have so much trouble? I don't believe that the pampered Evelyn can walk through this rainforest. Edward sneered and said, "She is the reincarnation of the Pharaoh's guard and the princess. She has people protecting her. Unlike us, we are already a thorn in the side of Anubis." At this time, Chun-Ong, who was walking at the front, suddenly said, "Interesting. It seems that Anubis really doesn't want to let us go. Everyone, be careful. I'm afraid there is trouble ahead." David and the others looked ahead and could vaguely see a road in the jungle ahead. There seemed to be something hanging on both sides of the road. When the team got closer, they found that it was a cage made of rot tan. There were piles of rotten bones inside. They naturally recognized that this was the remains left behind by the jungle aborigines that O'Connor and the others met in the original novel. These skeletons had a great origin. Chun-Ong looked at the details and tried to figure it out. This skeleton's bones are soft, especially the teeth. They are abnormally rotten. Although they have decayed for hundreds of years, we can still see the traces of the blue lines, Chun-Ong said and turned back. Of course, it doesn't mean that after hundreds of years of decay, there are still traces of lead poisoning on the bones. It means that the characteristics of the bones are similar to the blue lines. There is no doubt that this is the result of the heavy metal damaging the bones. I heard that in the Roman era, the city's waterway system used lead metal to wrap the pipes, causing the upper class of Rome to suffer from lead poisoning. This led to the decline of Rome. Seeing it today, it does make some sense. It can be seen that the identity of this ancient Roman soldier who is eaten by the indigenous people is quite extraordinary. With great interest, Chenong even commented on the preservation techniques of the cannibal skeletons. Under the horrified expressions of Edward, David, and the rest, he analyzed, these indigenous people seem to use human bones as decorations and totems. This can be seen from the skulls that are stuck on the sticks around us. They have strong religious and ritual characteristics. However, the skeletons that they can obtain are limited, so they have no choice but to develop the preservation techniques of skeletons. They have preserved the skeletons from the ancient Roman era and even the Napoleonic era as if they are alive. This technique has already surpassed most of the ancient civilizations. I don't know if they developed it themselves or if it was given by Anubis. The technique seems to be somewhat similar to black witchcraft. As he was speaking, Chenong pushed open a tree hole and pointed at the skulls that were piled up into a wall inside. This head shrinking technique is a symbol of the local voodoo in Africa. Wizards boil herbs to shrink the skulls so that they can be stored and used to make witchcraft materials and magic tools. David endured the discomfort and had to interrupt Chenong. "Doctor, we know that you are very knowledgeable, but what's the point of telling us this?" Chenong sighed. "Rotten wood can't be carved. When you meet those dwarves who practice witchcraft, you'll know if it's useful for me to teach you these things. Since I've already mentioned the head shrinking technique, I am reminding you that among the enemies you will encounter, there are not only the cannibal indigenous warriors who can shoot poison arrows and are agile, but also the African voodoo witchcraft." The faces of Edward and the rest of them changed greatly. They glared at David, who interrupted them, not realizing that they were also impatient before. They said eagerly, "Professor Chun, there's no need to argue with such a rude person. We're more than willing to learn more." Chun Ong clapped his hands and sighed. "No need. We are running out of time." He looked around at the quiet jungle and finally emphasized, "Oh, Connor is right. Those dwarfs are indeed not monsters summoned by Anubis. They are primitive indigenous tribes who believe in the blood sacrifice of Anubis. Anubis should be here to verify the ancient blood sacrifice faith with them. Those ferocious dwarf warriors who don't look like humans at all should be a technique of the voodoo cult to create voodoo warriors. The African Aborigines call them resurrected corpses. Of course, with the height of these dwarfs, they can only be called resurrected dolls. This kind of witchcraft is somewhat similar to the Chinese corpse refining technique, but it is different from the Chinese corpse refining technique, which uses yin to yang and carries on the mystery of immortality. The method of making the resurrected corpse is extremely cruel. It requires refining a living person into a living dead, using highly toxic and hallucinogenic witchcraft drugs, together with blood sacrifice, concoction, and other witchcraft methods to turn a living person into a living dead that has no sense of pain and is not afraid of death. Generally speaking, resurrected corpses are very powerful. Because the drug blocks the self-protection measures of the human body, the resurrected corpses are burning their life force, regardless of the limits of the muscles and bones. Therefore, they will not easily lose the ability to fight back, even if they are seriously injured. However, this cannibal indigenous tribe has a special physique, and their witchcraft may also be mixed with the evil spells passed down by Anubis. They are even more difficult to deal with. At this time, everyone could already hear the rustling sound in their ears. Chun-Ong calmly looked at the positions of the self-concealing dwarves and finally said, "They have many witchcraft and strong poisons on their bodies. It is best to kill them from a distance, and they should wear positive energy protective equipment. Teaching them how to be human is only a matter of a hand. Everyone should pay attention to protect themselves first." Chun-Ang's words seemed to be nonsense, but in fact he pointed out all the secrets of the cannibal dwarves. Otherwise, with the lack of information, the Samsara travelers would not be able to deal with them with the methods they use to deal with humans. The voodoo witchcraft wizards hidden outside the intelligence network were more likely to pose an unexpected threat to the samsara travelers. Now that the samsara travelers were on guard, their killing efficiency was at least several times higher than before. At some point, several octopus vampires had quietly disappeared into the jungle. They were better at hiding than the dwarves. A sharp light flashed in Edward's eyes, and the crossed sword in his hand slashed downward. The cross slash, which had been accumulating power for a long time, neatly cut off the heads of 3 dwarves. At Chenang's gesture, the vampire warriors also held their guns and counterattacked. Bullets and the swords of the samsara travelers intertwined, quickly reaping the lives of the reckless dwarves. The weak point of their heads was their heads, and their skulls were scattered everywhere. Under the slaughter of the samsara travelers, they were almost powerless. The whole scene looked like a group of perverts slaughtering children.